My name is Ashley. I'm 28 years old. And this is the story of the day my own family taught me that pain, when ignored, turns people into criminals. It was supposed to be a simple backyard birthday barbecue for my brother Jason. Massachusetts sky so blue it hurt to look at. New pool deck gleaming like a magazine spread. And the usual crowd of his friends, men who had learned from him that cruelty could be dressed as charisma if you smirked the right way after you did it. I arrived with a card, $200 tucked inside, and the practice calm my therapist taught me to wear like armor. My mother air-kissed my cheek and gave me the once-over shoulders to shoes. Good, she murmured, as if I were a centerpiece placed correctly. Your father is very proud of this deck. Try not to draw attention. Drawing attention was the family accusation I grew up with. Crying after getting locked in a dark basement at 12? Drama. Failing a science project because someone poured water on my display board? You should have prepared. By someone, everyone meant Jason, but our family had agreed long ago on a story where he never did harm and I never told the truth correctly. The backyard was already rowdy. My father, Douglas, commanded the grill like a general, facts and temperature charts in his head. Emotions checked at the door. Pain as weakness leaving the body could have been stamped on his apron. Jason, 3 years older, leaned against the railing with a beer like a prop. He had gone soft around the middle since high school, but his mouth was still sharp. Well, well, he called, raising his bottle when he saw me. Our very own guest of honor. You made it, sis. I forced a smile and said the safe things. The deck really did look beautiful, Brazilian hardwood, the kind of wood you select to be seen with. Cost a fortune, Jason said loudly, because money was another family language. Dad spared no expense. It was the kind of comment that landed between us like a dare. 6 months earlier they'd mailed me a gift card for my 30th. Jason's new jet ski was on a laminated photo by the presents. I made it an hour by staying near the pitchers of water, and the wives who glowed with that lightly strained politeness you learn when a partner's friends become your second job. Jason's voice, too loud, chased me anyway. Remember when we convinced Ash the neighbor's lab had rabies? Laughter. Or that time we switched her shampoo with hair remover? More laughter, the kind that tells you people like you best as an old punchline. With every memory weaponized, my chest got tight. I touched my phone in my pocket like a worrystone. I'd promised myself I could leave whenever I needed to. I told Jason I was heading out. He slid into my path, smile too bright. Come on. Have a drink. Don't be so. He didn't finish the sentence, but I heard uptight, I heard soft. I heard the 100 names for a girl who learned to swallow panic in a house that rewarded silence. No thanks, I said, stepping sideways. He stepped with me. The beer in his hand tipped, and a cold bloom of suds slopped onto my blouse. Oops, he said, popping the pea like a firework. His friends laughed. I didn't. I walked toward the glass door because that was the only power I had left. Retreat. The deck shifted under my flats like a living thing. There was a kind of silky resistance against the wood that didn't feel like water. I glanced down. The boards were clean, shining. Too shining. A sheen almost invisible unless you were looking for it. I barely had time to register the thought, this isn't right, before my right foot flew forward as if someone yanked it. My left followed. The world tipped backward. The sky broke into fragments in my eyes. Then my lower back and head found the concrete lip of the pool with a sound I felt in my teeth. I knew 3 things instantly. 1. My head was ringing so loud I couldn't hear my own gasp. 2. The sun was too hot on my face and yet I felt cold down my arms like falling into winter. 3. There was nothing below my waist. Not numb like waking up on a sleeping limb. Nothing like a radio cut to static. I tried to sit. My core answered with a lightning bolt of pain and then static again. My legs didn't answer at all. Help, I said. But it came out like I was 10 feet underwater and the surface was sliding away. I can't feel. Jason leaned over me, upside down, grinning. You always were a theater kid, he said. 10 out of 10 for commitment. Jason, I said, finding the part of my voice that was still mine. I can't move my legs. I hit my back. I need. He rolled his eyes and tipped his bottle, finishing it as if to punctuate his dismissal. You're fine. People gathered. They always do. My father arrived, spatula still in one hand like a weapon of rationality. What is this? he said, scanning my body the way he scanned spreadsheets. I told him as clearly as I could. I used small words. He gestured at the deck. Installed yesterday by professionals. Walk it off, Ashley. That's not how this works. I whispered, and it sounded like someone else. My mother's face appeared, tense with the effort of pleasing the crowd. Please stop, she hissed at me. People are staring. You're ruining your brother's birthday. I tasted bile. I said it again to all of them, to anyone. I can't feel my legs. Call an ambulance. I was begging my own blood. Probably drunk, Jason announced. Classic Ash. I had not touched a drop. The crowd parted as a woman moved through with the kind of authority that makes a circle obey. She knelt beside me. I'm a nurse, she said, voice low and steady. ER at Mass General. My name's Rachel. Don't move. Can you feel me touching here? She pressed on my shin, my calf, my foot. The gray space where my body should have been stayed gray. No, I said. The word tasted like metal. It's gone. She took my pulse, looked at my pupils, scanned the boards with her palm. Her fingers came away with a gloss she rubbed between thumb and forefinger. This isn't water, she said, and her voice changed, not loud, just heavy. She looked up at the circle. Who put lubricant on this deck? My mother sputtered. My father bristled. Rachel was already on the phone. 911. Possible spinal cord injury, loss of sensation below the waist, fall onto concrete edge, hazardous surface likely present. Jason tried on a shrug that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5. It was a joke, he muttered, eyes aimed at the horizon. Just a little deck oil on a few boards. Thought she'd slip into the pool. That's all. Silence can be very loud. In that silence, my entire childhood arranged itself and reached a conclusion. It looked like a man who believed pain was a weakness, and a woman who believed appearance was a virtue. It looked like a boy who learned you could hurt people and call it a prank. And it looked like me, a girl who learned to apologize for bleeding. The sirens wailed nearer. I focused on Rachel's face and on the breath she counted with me. In for 3. Hold for 2. Out for 4. You're going to be okay, she said, and I believed her even while I didn't know what okay meant anymore. Paramedics appeared. A woman named Sarah, another named Kim, a man who moved like he knew when to be gentle and when to be fast. Hi, Ashley, Sarah said, kneeling where Rachel had been. We're going to keep your spine as still as possible. You might feel a collar go on. We'll roll you together. Document the surface, Sarah told the man without looking away from me. Photos, samples. We're going to need police. Police? My father snapped. Absolutely not. Absolutely yes, Sarah said so calmly he had to stand down. Someone intentionally created a hazard. And there was a delay in seeking care after a reported loss of sensation. That's not an accident. That's a scene. They slid the rigid collar beneath my neck like they were sliding a note under a locked door. On my count, Sarah said. 1, 2, 3. The world moved in a single piece underneath me, and pain forked through my torso like lightning trying to decide which tree to choose. I cried out and felt shame about it in the same breath. Old habits. We'll give you something for the pain in the rig, Kim said. Hang in. On the stretcher under the sky, I caught a last picture I didn't ask to keep. My father red-faced with impotence that finally met a wall it couldn't scold down. My mother hugging herself like a child waiting for permission to cry. Jason emptying another beer, staring at the wet shine on the boards like it could confess for him. A cruiser slid into the driveway. The party thinned. Guests trotting to their cars with excuses like confetti in the air. Inside the ambulance, Sarah placed an oxygen mask over my mouth and started in 4. You did everything right by asking not to be moved, she said. Every minute matters with spinal injuries. The rig doors closed, and with them the last draft of my family's denial. For the first time all day, I felt a strange, fierce quiet. Someone believed me. The ambulance accelerated. I closed my eyes and let the world go black. When I woke, I knew I wasn't in my body because everything was too clean. That hospital antiseptic smell that finds the back of your throat and stays. The beeping that argues with silence. The fluorescent light that can't be called day or night. A nurse with kind eyes and a tag that said Carlos smiled when I blinked. Welcome back, Ashley, he said. You're at Mass General. You had surgery a few hours ago. We'll let the doctor explain. My throat was raw. He held a straw in patience to my lips. Water tasted like a miracle. Dr. Martinez arrived with silver in her hair and authority that was not sharp but exact. She sat down so our eyes were level. You suffered an incomplete spinal cord injury at the T12L1 level, she said. 2 fractured vertebrae, bone fragments compressing the cord. We went in to stabilize with rods and screws and to decompress the cord. The surgery went as planned. Incomplete, I repeated. The word was a rung on a ladder I did not yet know how to climb. It means the cord wasn't severed. It means the range of outcomes is wide. She turned a tablet toward me. My spine looked like a storm had passed through it and left artifacts. We don't talk in certainties at this stage. Some patients regain significant function. Others don't. The first 48 hours are important. The first year is where most recovery happens. What we can promise is that we will fight for every millimeter with you. Will I walk again? I asked because hope and terror can be the same question. We'll learn what your body will give back, she said. And we'll build your life around truth, not fear. It should have comforted me. In some way it did. In another, it yawned open a new grief I couldn't name yet. I thought of my second graders, the way they swarmed me after recess with shoelaces to tie and secrets to whisper. I thought of my apartment with the narrow stairs and the mugs I kept on the top shelf because I liked the way I reached for them when the morning light came through. I thought of how many times I had been told to walk it off, and I tasted the poison in the advice on my tongue. Dr. Martinez said there were officers who wanted to speak with me if I felt able. I said yes because something hard inside me that was not my bones clicked into place when Sarah said the word scene. 2 women came. Detective Sullivan with hair in a tight coil and a gaze that felt like a safe container. Officer Chun with a notebook and the careful attention of someone trained to catch what people leave unsaid. They kept the questions simple and let me answer slowly. I told them about the slickness on the deck and the way my feet had gone out together, the impact on the concrete edge, the absence below my waist like a power outage. I told them about my father's scorn and my mother's hiss, about Rachel's hands and Sarah's voice, and about the sheen on Rachel's fingers that was not water. To be clear, Detective Sullivan said, choosing words the way surgeons choose instruments, your brother admitted in front of multiple witnesses to applying deck oil to the boards you slipped on. Yes, I said, and felt my chest try to shake with something that would be sobbing if I had the spare oxygen for it. He said it was a joke. Officer Chen looked up. Paramedics documented the substance and collected samples. Several witnesses confirmed the sequence and the delay in calling for help. Based on that and the admission, we took your brother into custody last night. He's being held on suspicion of reckless endangerment causing serious bodily injury. The words came like stones into a lake. They sank, and the ripples went out to places in me I hadn't named. And my parents? Detective Sullivan glanced at her partner. The district attorney is reviewing criminal negligence and failure to provide aid. We're not in the business of tearing families apart, she added. But we are in the business of protecting people and holding others accountable when they choose not to. The nurse had to adjust my oxygen because my breath decided to learn a new rhythm. I kept thinking absurdly of a moment when I was 7 and Jason pushed me off my bike. I broke my wrist. My father told me it was my fault for not gripping properly. In the ER, my mother fretted about the bill. We don't cry over little things, she said. And I believed her because kids will believe anything if it keeps them inside the story where parents are right. I looked at the 4 taped to my arm and thought, this is not a little thing. It never was. After the detectives left, a social worker came. Marcus. He had the kind of presence that adds oxygen to a room just by entering. He spoke in the future tense, which was a mercy. Inpatient rehab, then outpatient. Modifications for my home. Vocational adjustments. Caregivers, equipment, insurance. Words that built a bridge away from the cliff. Do you have people? He asked. Friends, I said, thinking of my teacher buddies who would bring casseroles and orderliness, and of my neighbor Ms. Ortiz, who had keys to my apartment and a way with emergencies. My family. The rest of that sentence went nowhere anyone needed to hear. He nodded like he understood both what I'd said and what I hadn't. By evening, the anesthesia haze thinned enough for me to see the shape of my new life like a coastline I hadn't sailed but would now be shipwrecked on and somehow learn to call home. Pain arrived in waves. I rode with my breath and the PCA button in my hand. Sleep came in skids and stutters. At 2 in the morning, when the world felt like a held note, my phone buzzed on the tray. A voicemail. My mother's number. I pressed play. Her whisper was stage ready. Ashley, it's Mom. I hope you're comfortable. Your father says this is all going to spiral if you talk to the police wrong. Just tell them you slipped. Don't make it bigger than it is. Think about Jason's future. He didn't mean it. Call me when you get this. She hung up without saying I love you. Of course she did. I kept the message. I forwarded it to the detectives. I sent a copy to myself with the subject line, proof of pattern. Then I lay back and let my eyes sting without blinking because the air in the room was clean enough to hurt. The next morning brought Dr. Martinez, who checked reflexes that weren't there yet and sensation maps that were unpredictable but not hopeless. You have some preservation, she said, tapping my thigh and watching me watch her. That's good. We avoid promises, but we don't avoid possibilities. Possibility had always been something I built for other people. For my students. For the children I hadn't had but designed reading corners for anyway. For my family, even when I spun their failures into jokes so I could stay in the room without burning up. Hearing it pointed at me felt like someone opening a window in a house I'd thought was sealed. The assistant DA came that afternoon, crisp suit, voice that didn't rush. Laura Jensen. She explained a world of words I'd never had to learn. Arraignment, indictment, plea. Evidence is strong, she said. The paramedic's documentation, witness statements, physical samples. There's also the voicemail your mother left you. Her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll pursue charges we believe we can prove. What does justice look like? I asked, and my voice surprised me by how steady it was. Not vengeance, she said, as if reading my fear. Accountability. And resources for you. There is also a civil path. Medical care for spinal injuries is expensive. Lifetime expensive. You deserve support to live a full life. The civil attorney she referred, Michael Greenberg, came with a gentle way of saying hard things. Your parents' homeowner's insurance will have limits, he said. Your brother's and father's assets are separate legal questions, but there are routes. This isn't about punishing. It's about building you a future. I wanted to say I had a future even without money because I hated how money moved inside my family's story like a judge. But when the nurse changed my sheets and 3 people had to roll me in concert to keep my spine safe, I understood that pretending money doesn't change pain is another lie we tell because it sounds noble. That night, my friend Tasha from the 2nd grade team smuggled in contraband coffee and a photo the kids drew. Ms. A on a throne of books, a crown made of crayons. She cried so hard her nose ran and laughed so hard she hiccuped and said, "We've got your back." Like a promise and a pun. I let myself be held. In the days that followed, inches became the measure of my life. An inch gained in sensation. An inch of transfer from bed to chair. An inch of appetite. An inch of honesty when the rehab psychologist asked about my childhood and I didn't make it cute. I learned to move without twisting. I learned to ask without apologizing first. I learned that power can be a quiet thing that sits in your spine even when your spine is hurt. On the 7th day, Rachel came by. She stood at the foot of my bed, hands tucked into her scrubs. "You scared me," she said with a smile that was allowed now that the worst had passed. "You were brave." I told her she changed everything. She shrugged like it was a Tuesday. "We do this for strangers," she said softly, and added after a beat, "Sometimes it's easier than doing it for family." 2 detectives came again. Jason had been arraigned. My parents were under investigation. The paramedic's photo showed glistening lines of oil spread like invisible tripwires on the wood. A neighbor's outdoor camera captured Jason and his friend Tyler the night before, laughing with a can in hand, painting 4 boards in the precise square where I would later walk. I felt both sick and vindicated. A prosecutor's voice on speakerphone said, "This is not a prank. This is foreseeable harm." I slept with the collar on and dreamed my legs were rooms that had been locked and lights inside them still flickered. I woke and pressed the PCA and breathed and tried to imagine keys. Rehab was its own country with laws I learned by living them. Morning PT until my shoulders shook, afternoon OT with a tray of buttons and zippers that felt like puzzles designed by a cruel god. Group sessions where the veterans taught the rookies how to joke about bowel programs because if you don't laugh you will drown. I kept a calendar where I circled the days I didn't cry and the days I did, and neither was morally superior. David, my primary PT, had a grin that said he'd seen miracles and a voice that refused to promise them. We chase function, not fantasies, he said. And fantasies have a funny way of turning into function when you're stubborn. He put me between parallel bars with braces on my legs that made me feel like a robot trying to remember a song. Stand, he said. I stood with his hands on my hips and the world tilted and righted, and I cried so hard my nose ran. Good, he said, not because I stood, but because I let the crying happen. Meanwhile, the legal world moved like a chess game where I was both queen and casualty. Michael took my deposition, and then he took my parents' and Jason's. I wasn't in the room when Jason spoke, but I read the transcripts. I didn't think, he said. It was just oil. She's always been dramatic. The court reporter caught the pause before dramatic like a shrug you could hear. My father's transcript was a marvel of deflection. I had the deck installed by licensed professionals, he said when asked if the surface could be slippery. I was grilling. I didn't witness the fall. When asked why he didn't call 911, he bristled on paper. I don't accept the premise of your question. My mother's transcript was a tangle of trembling and image control. We love our daughter, she said. She's always had a flair for theatrics. When the attorney played her voicemail, there was a silence recorded in brackets. Witness does not respond. The criminal case crested first. Jason took a plea. Felony reckless endangerment. 5 years, 2 to serve, 3 probation. His lawyer called it a youthful mistake. The DA called it accountability. I called it a line drawn in ink between what we do to each other and what we're allowed to call a joke. My parents accepted probation and community service mandatory counseling, a year of sitting in rooms where other people said out loud the things they'd always swallowed. The day they stood before the judge, my legs were filling with that pins and needles electricity more often. I took it as a sign that the universe didn't only take. The civil case was slower and more surgical. Insurance caps are numbers that feel like insults when set against the price of a body. Michael explained actuarial tables like bedtime stories for a world that measures pain in spreadsheets. How much a life with wheels and braces costs. How much time missed from work costs. What a remodel costs to turn an upstairs life into a ground floor one. What caregivers cost. What adaptive tech costs. What a person's lost ease costs when you can't put a price on it but you must anyway. I signed papers with a hand that trembled and then steadied. We settled before trial. The insurance paid its maximum. My parents sold the house with the perfect deck. Below market. A cousin relayed to me in a text I didn't answer. They liquidated part of their retirement and placed $2 million in a trust, with disbursements controlled by a neutral administrator and subject to my life, not their whims. I felt guilty and then furious at feeling guilty. My therapist, Claire, who had the gift of naming rot and planting gardens over it, said, "This isn't blood money, Ashley. It's scaffolding. Take it and build." So I built. Ramps instead of stairs. A bathroom that felt like a spa because dignity is not a luxury. A car with hand controls that made me holy the first time I merged onto the highway alone and cried at 60 miles an hour. At work, the district created a curriculum specialist role I could do from my laptop with interludes of in-person teacher trainings. My second graders sent videos of themselves reading to stuffed animals, and I watched each one like a movie premiere. 2 months into rehab, a woman named Tara wheeled up to me in the cafeteria and said, "How's your heart?" I said, "It's learning a new job." She laughed and showed me her braces, how she used forearm crutches on days when the weather wasn't mean. You won't be the same. That's the grief. You won't be worse. That's the secret. In those months, I also built something quieter. A record. I saved every voicemail, every text, every email from my mother telling me to keep quiet for the sake of image. From my father threatening to limit your access to the family if you tarnish us. From Jason's friends calling me words I learned to delete without looking. I gave copies to Michael and to the DA. I gave one copy to myself and labeled it, the story they tried to tell. I didn't plan it as a weapon. I planned it as a mirror. But mirrors can cut when you break them in court. By the time I moved back to my apartment, transformed into a place where I could be at home in my body as it was, not as I'd been told it should be, I was also enrolled in a master's program in educational psychology, concentration in trauma-informed teaching. It felt like a rebellion and a return. I had been raised to believe pain teaches you not to feel. I would learn how pain, understood and named, can teach you to feel in safer ways. Friends stacked my fridge with meals and my shelves with books and my calendar with visits, so that loneliness couldn't sneak in and pretend to be a fact. Ms. Ortiz scolded me in Spanish for trying to carry laundry, then taught me a system with baskets and hooks that made the task mine again. And then, one evening, the world sent back to me a version of the girl I used to be and the woman I was trying to become. My phone pinged with an email from an address I recognized before I read the name. A DOC account. Subject line: no excuses, no ask. Jason was 4 months into his sentence. His handwriting filled the scanned pages. He did not itemize. He did not justify. He did not use the word prank. He wrote about therapy classes in prison where men learn to put the word harm in their mouths and swallow it. He wrote, I was raised to believe getting away with it meant it wasn't wrong. He wrote, you were telling the truth our whole lives and I made that a sin. I am sorry. He wrote, you owe me nothing. I hope you get every inch back. If you never want to see me again, I understand. If you ever do, say when, and I will show up the way I should have before. I read it twice, then a third time, and then I put it in a folder labeled letters I don't know what to do with. Forgiveness is a word people like to throw at the wounded, because it relieves them of the itch to act. I wasn't against it. I wasn't ready to pick it up like a task and cross it off and announce I was better. Healing I was learning isn't a performance. It's a practice. The twist in my story, if that's what we're calling it, came like most real twists do, built over years and then snapping into visibility in a day. It began with a message from a local nonprofit director who ran a spinal cord injury advocacy group. Someone at the hospital had given her my name. We need a mentor who speaks education, she wrote. Parents who don't understand IEPs and trauma. Teachers who want to help but don't have language. Would you meet? I met. One training at a school turned into 3. A district-wide PD day turned into a pilot program. A donor heard me speak about the difference between discipline and repair, and wrote a check with too many zeros. A friend of a friend with a podcast invited me on to talk about gaslighting in families, and how institutions can replicate it. The clip went, as the children say, viral. People wrote to me from places I had never been and told me their pain in paragraphs. I cried so much I learned to hydrate specifically for grief. When local news did a segment on my case, public records, the plea, the settlement, parents in our town who had always thought of my family as that admirable Matthews clan, sent me messages that were half apology and half confession. We saw what we wanted, one wrote. We didn't help. I did not need their help anymore. But other girls did. So I agreed when the nonprofit asked me to co-create a program that would sit between school and hospital, between legislation and living rooms, between people who meant well and people who needed better. We called it Stand Tall, not because walking is the goal but because standing up however you stand is. The day we incorporated as a 501c3, the letter from the IRS felt like a deed to land I'd been told I could never own. We found a small office 2 blocks from the rehab center where I'd learned to transfer without fear. It had big windows and a back room we turned into a lending library. Braces, cushions, shower chairs, all the awkward expensive things insurance takes too long to approve. On opening day, Rachel came. Sarah came. David came. Claire came. Tasha brought my students who'd made a banner that said MS. You stood up for US first. I cut the ribbon with scissors that shook only a little. In the photo, I'm in my chair with the braces peeking under my jeans, and my face looks like someone who learned the hard way that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth with your whole body. I had not expected to become influential. Wealthy even less so. But influence is what people call it when you speak in rooms you used to clean up after. And wealth is what happens when a settlement meets a nonprofit that refuses to hemorrhage money on image and spends it on ramps, on aids, on rest. Grants came. A book contract I almost turned down became both a machined anger and a soft thing that let other women put down their stories for a minute and breathe. I didn't buy a house, but I bought myself large margins on paper and in life. Jason was released at 2 years. He wrote again. I didn't write back. Not yet. My parents moved to Florida and curated their own narrative. Tragic accident. Someone from their HO wrote me, meaning she believed them or wanted to. I didn't correct her. I didn't need to be believed by everyone anymore. The day a county inspector called to ask if I knew about a building code complaint filed a year earlier regarding the deck. Non-compliant finish, improper ceiling. I remembered a thin night in high school when I watched my father paint over a stain instead of cleaning it because guests were coming. Some patterns are up in the bones of a thing. And yet, not everything stays. Not every pattern wins. The county inspector's voicemail sat in my notifications like a pebble in a shoe. "Ms. Reeves," he said. My name said carefully like he'd rehearsed it. "We're following up on a complaint about the finish used on the deck at your parents' former residence. There may have been non-compliant materials and unpermitted work. If you're willing, we'd appreciate a statement." Once upon a time I would have deleted it because everything that sounded like conflict lived like a fire in my chest. I forwarded it to Laura Jensen, then to Michael, then to myself, where it joined the folder I called the story they tried to tell. Laura wrote back within 10 minutes. "Not necessary for criminal case. Useful context if additional civil proceedings arise. Your choice." Michael wrote, "This may intersect with their insurer's subrogation rights. Another way the truth pays its own bills." I didn't crave one more bruise on my parents' record. But I did crave a world where the record reflected what actually happened. I typed a statement and ended it with a line that would have gotten me grounded at 13. For 28 years, appearances stood in for safety. I'm done helping with that. The day after, David leaned his hip against the parallel bars and raised an eyebrow like a coach who knows you hate him today and will love him in the photograph later. "Legs on," he said. We fitted the braces. He strapped me in with a gentleness that felt like a secret and stepped back as if to say, "Look who's doing the work." Standing wasn't new anymore, but standing without that hollowed-out fear was. When I lifted my right leg, the brace caught and my hip jerked. "Slow," David said, and the word found a place inside me that still obeyed. "Left leg. Shift." Micro steps that looked like nothing heroic to an outsider and felt like winning a war fought in millimeters. Sweat pooled under the hard plastic. My palms slipped on the rails. I forgot to breathe and remembered again. A loop that would likely define me forever. "Okay," he said. "Take a seat." I sat and the world spun, my blood pressure having opinions. I squeezed the foam handles of the wheelchair until my knuckles blanched. A new voice from behind me said, "May I?" The voice had the kind of warmth people use with skittish animals and children who have been lied to. He stepped into view. Early 30s, scruff he hadn't committed to, eyes that did not flinch from seeing you exactly as you were. "Thomas," he said. "Neuro-PT. I float between floors. Been following your case notes." He unhooked the blood pressure cuff, repositioned it without the inevitable Velcro scream. When the numbers read more like a person and less like a ghost, he nodded. "You've got a good engine," he said. "It stalls when it's tired. That's not weakness. It's physics." I wanted to tell him that in my family physics had always been a synonym for excuses. That the laws of motion were less important than the law of my father. Get up, move, compete, win. Instead I said, "Thanks," and filed away the way he made the room feel wider. Later, when we would call what grew between us a romance, I would think. It began with him waiting for me to catch up to my own breath. The district invited me to keynote a professional development day. My first instinct was no, public speaking is just panic with a microphone, but then I thought of my 8-year-olds with shaky hands at the classroom rug, and how I'd always told them the thing you're afraid of is a door, not a wall. I said yes and then stayed up the night before writing notes I never looked at. I told my story without names and without venom. I said I had been trained by my family to distrust my own pain, and by the world to accept that training as grit. I said kids who learn to swallow their truth become adults who bleed quietly and then apologize for the mess. I talked about Rachel saying, "I'm a nurse," like a shield and a key. I talked about Sarah saying, "Seen," like an incantation that called accountability into the room. When I finished, the auditorium stood up and made the kind of noise that used to scare me, but now sounded like a roof coming off a house that needed light. The clip found its way online. Teachers shared it, then parents who had been told their children were dramatic, then adults who had been children like me and grew up anyway. The email subject lines changed from "so inspiring" to "how do we build this where we live?" Then a lawmaker's aide reached out. The State Committee on Public Health was considering a bill around duty to render aid in suspected spinal injuries. Would I testify? Yes, I wrote, and my fingers shook not with fear, but with a current I didn't have words for yet. Power felt like that, like electricity you learned to channel so it didn't burn you from the inside. News traveled the old-fashioned way too. A cease and desist arrived on letterhead from my parents' newly retained attorney in Florida, informing me that my public storytelling defamed them and made allegations beyond the scope of the adjudicated facts. Michael chuckled without humor. "They're used to the room shifting when they raise their voice," he said. We drafted a response that was all spine. Public records attached. Direct quotes from their depositions. The voicemail from my mother transcribed, bracketed, and dated. "Truth is an absolute defense," Michael wrote. "My client will continue to tell the truth." I didn't post the letter. I didn't need to. I printed it and slid it into the folder with everything else. On the tab in thick black marker I wrote, "The story that holds." Jason requested a restorative justice meeting. The prison had a program, facilitated no contact without consent, nothing that would require me to forgive on command. Claire sat with me as I went back and forth. "You don't have to," she said. "And you don't have to never." In the end, I wrote conditions on a yellow legal pad like a teacher writing objectives. He would speak to a group of high schoolers in our town about pranks that aren't jokes. He would sign an affidavit acknowledging what he did and what our parents did after. He would authorize me to release those documents if he ever backtracked. He agreed to all three. The room at the prison wasn't as dramatic as the shows make it, which helped. A table. 2 chairs spaced like the space could protect me from old reflexes. A facilitator with a voice like a piano bench, solid, unremarkable, exactly what it needed to be. Jason came in wearing a uniform that made him look small, which I hated because smallness had been his excuse when he chose to be cruel. He sat. He didn't reach for me. He didn't look away. "I'm sorry," he said, and I braced for the but. It didn't come. "I thought getting away with it meant it wasn't wrong," he said, the same line from his letter, but dirtier, heavier out loud. He stared at his hands. "When you fell, Dad told me to wipe the boards. I took 2 steps and then the nurse, Rachel, was there and I didn't. I don't know if I didn't because I was scared of her or because some part of me knew that was the line, and once I crossed it, I was someone I couldn't get back from." He told me Mom whispered in his ear, "She's drunk, just say it." Like a script she pressed into his hand. He said he had rehearsed that script his whole life. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said, finally looking up. "I'm asking you to keep making a life where my apology matters less than your joy." It was the only request I could honor without breaking myself. Afterward, out in the parking lot, my legs went tight with spasms that felt like piano wire being tuned inside me by someone impatient. Thomas, who'd insisted on driving me, who had waited with a paperback and a thermos in a way that didn't feel like hovering, helped me transfer into the car with a slowness that made the spasms ease. He didn't say it would be okay. He said, "Tilt the seat back 2 degrees. And somehow that felt more like love than any slogan. On the way home, he pointed out a hawk riding a thermal above the interstate. "Look at it not moving and still going," he said. I watched it until my neck hurt. The next day, he texted me a blurry photo of another hawk. "Your bird," he wrote. I looked for them after that. My parents' version of events kept traveling. Because stories that protect people from the shame they've earned can sprint. I received a message from a woman in their new neighborhood who had seen my keynote and then had coffee with my mother. "She says she sits by your bed and prays with you every day." The woman wrote, meaning she believed my mother or wanted to. I stared at the words until they lost their edges. Then I sent her the public docket number for the criminal case, the dates of the hearings, the plea. I sent her the clip of my testimony to the Committee on Public Health in which I told the story of a nurse who said, "I'm a nurse," and a paramedic who said, "Seen," and a father who said, "Walk it off," and how those 3 phrases rearranged the rest of my life. I didn't write a paragraph. I didn't explain. Truth travels, I reminded myself. Sometimes it just walks. The committee hearing felt like standing in the doorway of a room where bigger rooms begin. I talked about the minutes after an impact, how immobilization is the difference between a bruise on the body and a bruise on the spinal cord. I described the specific terror of asking for help and being told your pain is a performance. A representative from the paramedics union sat behind me and nodded at the parts where we talk about resources. Rachel submitted written testimony. The bill moved out of committee with a new clause requiring mandatory reporting training for hosts of large events that install new structures, Liability education for the dads of the world who mistake carbon fiber coolers for expertise. Spinal grew faster than we could hire. A regional company donated a warehouse of medical equipment on the condition that we let their employees volunteer twice a month. We built a checklist for PTA presidents titled How to Care Without Breaking People. The first school that used it reported fewer suspensions and a 20% drop in defiance referrals. Code for kids who have learned not to trust anything louder than their own heartbeat. The superintendent cried when she told me. I didn't. I saved the tears for the car. Then the shower. Then the 15 minutes before bed when Thomas and I sat on the floor and put our feet against each other's and told the truth about our day. Do you miss your old life? He asked once like he'd been afraid to say it out loud. He was sitting cross-legged. I was in my chair with my braces unlatched, everything unarmored. Yes, I said, because I have made an oath to answer the question as asked. And I don't. Both are true in the same minute. Physics, he said, smiling, and I laughed because he remembered. On the 1-year anniversary of the fall, I went back to the rehab center as a peer mentor for the afternoon slot. In room 412, a 19-year-old boy stared at his feet like they were in a museum case. He told me he felt like a fraud when he cried. I told him I had cried on a freeway doing 60 and that the car didn't crash because my body is allowed to do 2 things at once now: mourn and move. I told him I have learned to make appointments with my grief instead of letting it ambush me in the cereal aisle. On my way out, the nurse at the desk slid me an envelope. A woman dropped this off, she said. Inside was a card with a photograph of a snow-covered trail and the words, "You don't know me, but I was at the party that day. I didn't help. I'm sorry." Enclosed was a donation receipt to Stand Tall for $50. I held the card like it was an artifact from a time we were all less brave and then put it in the folder with everything else. I don't keep trophies. I keep proof that people can change. 2 days later, a local reporter called about doing a follow-up story. Not the fall, not the case, but the program, the policy, the personal. You've become a symbol, she said, as if symbols are a thing you plan. I said yes on the condition that the story list the hotline number for spinal cord injury Massachusetts and include the sentence. If you think someone has a spinal injury, do not move them. Call 911. She agreed. The story ran on a Sunday. By Tuesday, we had 26 new mentor requests and a donation that made me sit down so I didn't fall. A foundation check with a memo line that read, "For the rooms between rooms." That night, I dreamed I was on the deck again, but when my feet flew out, the pool had turned into a soft field, and I landed on grass that held me. When I woke up, the first text on my phone was from Rachel. Saw the article. Coffee. When we met, she told me she'd started a class for bystander intervention tailored to injuries like mine. I used your story on slide 4, she said, and I made them write down the sentence. Believe the person who says they're hurt. It's free. Costs you nothing and might cost them everything if you don't. I love you, I blurted, and we both laughed because love doesn't always look like what they taught us it should. On my dresser sits a photo from the Stand Tall opening day. In it, I'm holding the ribbon with my left hand and the scissors with my right, and behind me you can see the reflection of the room in the window glass. Rachel's jawline, Sarah's bun, David's grin, Claire's eyes, Thomas's hands in his pockets. When I look at it, the ache is there and the pride is there, and neither cancels the other. And for once I don't try to make them. I know the internet will keep trying to make me a saint or a cautionary tale. I know my parents will keep curating a version of the past that helps them sleep. I know Jason will keep going to meetings in church basements and gymnasiums and telling boys who might be him not to call cruelty a joke. My job is not to manage their arcs. My job is to keep mine true. Next week, I'm scheduled to present at the State House again. This time on a funding bill that would put peer mentors in every rehab ward from the Berkshires to the Cape. The working title is Rachel's Law, because someone in the committee knows how to name a seed. I printed my testimony and tucked it into my bag. At the bottom of the last page, I wrote the sentence I will end on, the one I wish someone had said over my life at 8, at 12, at 16, at 28 on the pool deck under the brutal beautiful blue. Your pain is information, not insubordination. And maybe that's what this has all been, an education or re-education. A girl graduating from a house where survival meant silence into a world where survival means speaking, and building places where other people can speak too. The morning I went back to the State House to testify again, I woke before the alarm with the old dream in my mouth. The one where the deck becomes a field and I land on grass instead of concrete. I sat up, braced, and waited out the quicksilver spasms that arrive like weather and leave like it too. Thomas pretended to be asleep long enough to give me the dignity of winning the fight, then opened one eye and said, 2 degrees? And I laughed because our private joke about seat angles had become a language of care. The hearing was for the funding bill everyone had started calling Rachel's Law. And even though the nickname embarrassed her, it felt right to build something with a person's name instead of a number. When I rolled into the anteroom outside the chamber, the same aide who'd first emailed me months ago handed me a packet and whispered, "You've got more support than last time. The opposition is mostly budget hawks and a guy who thinks people should bootstrap their spines." I smirked because gallows humor makes good armor. On the table next to the coffee urns, my phone buzzed with 2 messages that did not belong together and yet did. The first was from a national morning show, all glossy kindness and exclamation points. "We'd love to feature your work with Stand Tall and your testimony. Are you available this Friday?" The second was from Michael. "Heads up. Your parents have retained counsel in Florida and filed a complaint alleging defamation based on your keynote and op-eds. We'll respond. Also good news. Anti-SLAPP statute is on our side." I clicked the morning show email open and felt adrenaline try on vanity. I closed it again. When you've been called dramatic your whole life, being invited to tell your story on television sounds like being asked to walk a tightrope that may or may not actually be there. I texted back 3 conditions: no ambush calls to my family, no B-roll of the fall, and a lower third that read advocate instead of victim. The producer replied within minutes. Agreed. I didn't believe them and also believed them enough to say yes because you can hold 2 truths at once when you've had to. Michael's message I took a different way. I called him. "I'm not going to stop talking," I said, and it came out flatter than bravado and stronger than fear. "Good," he said. "You're telling the truth. Truth isn't defamation. Also, and forgive the lawyerly glee, we've got a very sharp anti-SLAPP statute. We'll move to strike and ask for fees. People who use courts to shut people up should pay for the lesson." In the hearing, I told the committee about the minutes that matter most and the lies that last longest. I told them about a boy in room 412 who asked if crying made him a fake and how I told him his heart wasn't a courtroom. Behind me, a paramedic union rep testified that mandatory training would save them from fighting with party hosts who think YouTube is a medical degree. A contractor, surprising me, spoke in favor too, saying clear liability actually protects the majority who follow rules from the minority who cut corners and call it efficiency. The vote moved the bill forward. Outside, reporters asked for quotes. I gave them the line I'd written at the bottom of my testimony. "Pain is information, not insubordination." They wrote it down like it was new. When I got home, a thick envelope waited by the door. The cease and desist in formal dress. We scanned it, we laughed once without mirth. And then we did the dull heroic thing and responded in kind. Michael's motion to strike was a scalpel. Docket numbers, deposition excerpts, the voicemail transcript with my mother's stage whisper that asked me to lie. The law gave us a lever we pushed. The morning show segment aired 2 days later. They stuck to my conditions. They showed me at Stand Tall, matched with a mentor and a newly injured woman who asked off camera, "What if my boyfriend leaves?" And me answering, "Then that's information too." They cut to a clip of my testimony and included Rachel's face for 2 seconds, her jaw set with the kind of kindness that doesn't flinch. At the end, the anchor looked into the camera and said, "If you think someone has a spinal injury, do not move them. Call 911. It felt like I had smuggled a public service announcement onto a stage built for kitchen gadgets and celebrity divorces. Donations spiked in a way that made me dizzy. So did requests. So did people reaching out from their own private hells. A class action firm from out of state called, not to drag me into a circus but to ask if I'd serve as a paid expert on cases where a failure to render aid turned a survivable injury into something worse. "We want juries to understand the science," the partner said. "And the human." I said yes with the kind of careful language you use when you know your name will be read back to you someday under oath. We won the anti-SLAPP motion. The judge's order was crisp and unimpressed. My parents' claim was an attempt to chill public participation. The statements at issue were substantially true. Fees awarded to the defendant. Michael called me from the courthouse steps. I wish you could see your mother's lawyer trying to figure out how to explain the First Amendment to a client who thinks reputation is an asset you can polish with other people's silence. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I sat very still and let the dignity of it wash over me like hot water. This time when someone told me to stop talking, the law told them no. Jason's restorative justice conditions came due. He had to speak at the high school in our town to a room full of seniors cavalier enough to pretend they've never been cruel and honest enough to remember that they have. I went not as an honor guard, not as a watchdog, but because some part of me wanted to see if he would look at his old kingdom and tell the truth. He did. He stood without notes and said, "I thought being the golden one meant never being wrong." He said, "The night before my sister fell, I put oil on the boards because I wanted to see her slip. I told myself it would be funny. Every video you've laughed at that began with a person's humiliation. I wanted to make that in real life." He said, "When she told me she couldn't feel her legs, I told her she was dramatic because that's what I had always told her. It was wrong then. It is a crime now. Don't be me." His voice shook on the last part. They clapped the unsure clap people use when remorse is bigger than the room. A video of the talk made its way online. My parents' Florida fiction shrank like a sweater in hot water. A week later, a neighbor from the old street sent me a link to a video file I already knew from the criminal case. The security camera across the cul-de-sac picking up Jason and Tyler at midnight with a can and too much laughter. This time there was audio. A slurred line I hadn't heard before, Tyler saying, "Dude, she'll slip like a cartoon schwupp," and Jason answering, "She'll be fine." I watched it once, then asked Laura if releasing a redacted clip as part of a public education campaign would harm anything already decided. "No legal risk," she said. "Blur faces, bleep names, make it about the act, not the people." We did exactly that. Stantal posted a 30-second piece titled "A Joke Isn't a Safety Plan," with text overlaid, "Oil on a deck. A body on concrete. Minutes that matter. Call 911. The clip was watched 1,000,000 times in 2 days. The comments were a mess of humanity. I read 10 and then stopped because I've learned to ration how much of the internet I let into my bloodstream. Thomas, who had become a ritual as much as a person in my life, brought home a planter box he'd built at exactly wheelchair height. We filled it with herbs, basil, mint, rosemary, nothing fancy, everything useful. "This is your garden," he said, "but I will be the labor you hire when you need it." We drank iced tea that tasted like hope and sat with our feet touching. He did not ask me to move in or to let him move in. He measured the space between us with tenderness and waited for me to set the next marker. The patience made me brave in a way demands never had. News from Florida arrived through the same back channels that have always ferried family gossip. My parents' accountant friends were whispering that the state board was reviewing a complaint against my father, not for what happened to me but for filing a claim with his insurer that mismatched his permit applications. It wasn't mine to prey on, I didn't. I did think about the way a lie at one end of a life tends to tug at the truth at the other, eventually. The county inspector called back to say their investigation had concluded with fines for unpermitted work, and a note appended to the address record for the new owners. Reseal with approved materials only. It was so bureaucratic and so perfect I laughed out loud. Systems can fail you for years and still spit out a line of text that feels like justice. Stantal's second quarter numbers looked like something out of an annual report for a company execs brag about at conferences. I say that with the full knowledge that I had become, against my will and a little against my personality, a person whose spreadsheet columns measured impact in dollars and that my name was on a bank account that no longer made me sweat every time I opened the app. Wealth had migrated from a dirty word in my family lexicon, used to shame or show, to a tool with the same moral weight as a ramp. Does it let more people in? If it did, we used it. If it didn't, we asked why it existed. The governor's office called with an invitation I thought was a prank at first only because those old wires still run through me. A task force on injury prevention and community response, cross-agency, short-term with long-term teeth. We need someone who can translate between the medical, the legal, and the lived, the aide said, and it felt like being asked to become a bridge you'd once crawled across on your belly. I said yes and then sat very still for a long time in the living room and listened to the sound of the refrigerator hum and my own blood settle. Thomas came in from the hallway with that alertness he has when he senses a shift. I told him. He put his forehead to mine, what we do when words are too big, and said, I knew the room was going to get bigger. Jason sent me a scanned affidavit with a witness signature and a notary seal, as promised. In it, he wrote plainly what he had done and what our parents had done after, without flourish, without defense. He authorized me to release it if he ever publicly recanted. I put it in the folder and labeled a copy, for when memory lies. I didn't know then whether I'd ever use it. I only knew that this time, our family's archive would not belong to the loudest person. On a Saturday that looked like any Saturday, Thomas and I took the car to the coast and watched kites fight the wind while kids ate sunscreen with their hands. I transferred onto the sand with a technique we'd practiced in the living room onto a blanket, and it worked even though it looked ridiculous because most things worth doing look ridiculous the first 12 times. What would you go back and tell 8-year-old you? He asked, as if he knew exactly which part of my life was asking. That she's not making it up, I said. That being believed is a kind of food. That she should stash proof like a squirrel stashes nuts because one day she'll need to feast on it to survive winter. That she'll build summer. We drove home with the windows down because air that smells like salt fixes nothing and helps anyway. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, an email landed with the subject line, "Order on defendant's motion for fees." The court had done what Michael promised it could do. Awarded us the cost of defending against my parents' attempt to shut me up. It wasn't a fortune. It was a principal priced in dollars. I forwarded the PDF to Claire with only the words, "I am not their silence anymore." At the end of that week, the task force met in a conference room that could have been any conference room in America. Fluorescent lights, stale coffee, an agenda printed too small. We went around and said our names and roles. A surgeon, a firefighter, a school principal, a county clerk, a lobbyist who insisted she was just a citizen advocate, which made me like her immediately. When it was my turn, I said, "Ashley Reeves, stand tall. I speak for rooms between rooms." Someone at the end of the table scribbled that down, and I wondered if it would end up on a bumper sticker or a mission statement or a napkin in a drawer. We began. Halfway through the meeting, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I'm outside the State House. I want to talk." It was my mother. My stomach did that old childhood drop, the one where your body prepares for a test you haven't studied for because there is no test, only a performance. I didn't leave the room. I finished the agenda. I took notes on a pilot program that would put immobilization kits in community centers next to AEDs. I said yes when the chair asked if I'd draft the language for the public-facing materials. I sent Thomas a message, "She's here." He replied, "I'm parked 2 blocks away, engine warm. You don't have to go. You don't have to not." When the meeting adjourned and the hallway released everyone into afternoon, I rolled toward the elevator with my shoulders squared to a world that had finally, stubbornly, started to square up to me. Outside, the sun was too bright and the air tasted like spring trying out summer. I looked across the plaza. My mother stood near the steps in a coat 1 season too heavy, clutching her purse like a life raft. For the first time in my life, I understood that I could choose the terms of any conversation that happened next. I could choose whether it happened at all. I stopped under the statue of a woman cast in bronze, a torch in her hand and a scroll under her arm. I checked the time. I checked my breath. I checked myself for the old instinct to smooth things over until I disappeared. It wasn't there. I turned my chair and headed not toward my mother, but toward Thomas's car waiting at the curb, because the most radical thing I could do wasn't to forgive or to fight. It was to refuse to audition for a love that had never been offered without conditions. 2 degrees? He asked when I slid in, and I said, "Make it 3, and watch the State House get smaller in the side mirror as we pulled away, already writing the next testimony in my head, already planning the kits for the community centers, already deciding which garden herbs needed more sun. I slept like I'd run a marathon without leaving the car. That heavy, spent sleep that arrives when you choose yourself and your nervous system finally believes you. In the morning, my body registered the previous day's adrenaline the way it always does. Tight calves, a throb behind my ribs, the ghost sensation down the fronts of my shins that feels like wind through grass I can't see. Thomas brewed coffee and pretended not to watch me take my first transfer, like a man who knows the difference between hovering and witnessing. We ate toast with the herbs from our little planter crushed on top, basil, mint, and something that tasted like a beginning. Claire smiled the way therapists do when you bring them a truth you thought they'd have to pry out of you. "You didn't go to your mother," she said, and the sentence landed in my chest like a warm stone. I told her about the statue outside the State House and about the way my palms didn't sweat when I turned away. I told her about the 2-degree joke, how it was actually our way of naming dignity. You refused the audition, she said. It's the oldest audition in the world, for conditional love, for a role written for you by someone else. Your body remembers the lines, but you're not saying them anymore. I thought of all the times I'd rushed into rooms trying to save people from the discomfort of my pain and called it graciousness. What if I never go? I asked, surprising myself. Then you've already chosen a kind of peace, she said. And if you go later, you'll go on your terms. Repeat that to your bones. Rachel's law moved from committee to the floor with amendments that made it smarter, not softer. I took 3 calls that week from volunteers at community centers who'd placed our immobilization kits next to their AEDs and wanted to make sure they stocked the right cervical collars for children. We made the posters easy to read. I told them, call 911. Do not move them. Keep them still. Believe them. Everyone is a bystander until the second they become a witness. Our job was to make that second count. At the first training, a man in his 50s with a softball coach's build raised his hand to ask a question and then, unexpectedly, let it fall. I'm thinking about how many times I told kids they were fine so we could keep the game moving, he said, looking at the floor like a boy. I want a do-over. We can't give adults do-overs, we can give them tools. He left with 3 posters and a determination I have learned to trust more than apologies. The installer who'd worked on my parents' deck called Michael's office and asked to speak to me, off the record. Massachusetts is not a state where you can record conversations without consent, and I was not interested in playing amateur detective anyway. I asked Michael to take the call on a conference line. The man's voice trembled the way people tremble when a court file puts a mirror in their hands. Your father insisted on a particular sealant, he said, naming a brand I recognized from the inspector's voicemail. We told him it wasn't appropriate for the finish he'd chosen. He said he'd sign a waiver. A waiver that didn't exist, it turned out, which is another way of saying a man tried to sign his ego over to physics. The installer's lawyer had advised him to offer a sworn affidavit about the conversations and the permit shortcuts. I should have walked, he said, not to absolve himself but to tell the truth with his name on it. Michael thanked him and promised to route the affidavit to the right agencies. Consequences don't need vigilantes when systems remember how to use their teeth. Jason texted to ask if he could volunteer at the warehouse as part of his probation. No clients, no public-facing role, just lifting and labeling and learning the difference between cushion sizes. I said yes under conditions that made me feel like someone who had learned to build fences that are gates with locks. He'd be supervised. He'd sign the same boundaries our interns sign. We would not talk about family. He would treat the equipment as if it belonged to his own body. The first afternoon, Thomas reported back that Jason kept his head down and his hands busy. He lifted the heavy boxes like a man trying to repent with muscles, Thomas said, and I heard neither scorn nor sentiment in it, only a set of observations offered to me like a folded towel. The morning show call turned into a segment that turned into a polite frenzy in my inbox that turned, by some strange alchemy, into a book offer. The editor wrote a letter that made me cry because it did the thing most people don't bother to do. It understood the part of the story where silence is enforced by love, and love is confused with obedience. I don't want a trauma memoir, I told her on the phone. I want a field guide. Chapters that end with checklists, questions for teachers, scripts for paramedics to use with families who are panicking, pages you can photocopy. She said yes so quickly I had to sit down. We talked advance and deadlines and my non-negotiables. The cover would not be a woman in a hospital gown looking noble and near death. My mother's face would not appear as a shadow on any page. Rachel and Sarah would get veto power over the parts that used their names. When we hung up, I stared at my hands and thought about how wealth changes shape when it's made of words you wrote to keep other people from falling into the same holes. My parents' anti-SLAPP loss had to be paid in actual money. The court clerk's office mailed a check and a certified letter I didn't open until Thomas came home. The amount wouldn't fund a program. It would buy a dozen immobilization kits. We bought a dozen immobilization kits. I posted a photo of the boxes stacked up in the office with a caption that read, "Paid for by someone who tried to make me quiet." The comments were mostly hearts and exclamation points and one very earnest person arguing about tort reform. I closed the app after 7 minutes and took a walk around the block with my crutches. A ritual that hurts until it doesn't and then hurts again. A woman named Keisha came in to stand tall with her daughter, Lenny, who was 9 and had eyes that made you want to put a windbreak around her. She'd been in a car accident, incomplete injury at T11, the kind of clinical language that covers a life in a sheet you can't see through until someone lifts it. They said she might stand, Keisha whispered, like standing was something you had to ask permission for. Lenny watched me watching her. I saw you on TV, she said. You said people are allowed to cry and still be brave. I told her she could put that on a t-shirt and charge adults $20 and make enough to pay for a lifetime of good ice cream. She laughed, and the room felt like someone had opened a window. 3 months later, she walked between the bars with braces on her legs and looked like someone who had grown 2 inches of spine in a week. When I think of miracles, I think of that. Not the sudden but the slowly insistently earned. Rachel's law passed with a margin that made me feel like the state had learned how to vote for something besides fear. The governor signed it at a community center with our kit mounted on the wall behind him like art. He said the kind of things governors say on signing days, but when he turned away from the microphones he whispered to me, "My sister had a fall on ice when we were kids. We moved her. She's fine, but it was luck." Policy is what we do when we want to stop relying on luck. I texted Rachel a photo of the pen and the wall and wrote, "I'm naming the kit after you in our database." She wrote back, "You're ridiculous. Do it." I kept telling the truth in rooms that used to scare me, and the truth kept behaving like a seed that didn't care whether a field wanted it. It sprouted anyway. The high school invited me back not to talk about injury, but about consent and power and how pranks are often violence wrapped in charisma. If the punchline is someone else's body or fear, I told a room full of seniors who tried so hard not to be earnest, "You're not funny. You're unfinished." They laughed like they weren't sure if they were allowed to. I laughed back and told them I wasn't either. The old house showed up in a real estate alert by accident. An algorithm I hadn't bothered to turn off after I'd moved sent me a listing in the exact zip code that once made my stomach hurt. 3 photos in, I recognized the kitchen tile my mother had chosen because it matched a tear sheet in a magazine. The deck had been resealed, the listing bragged, with approved materials per the recent inspection. The price was ambitious for a market cooling down. I stared at the photo of the pool like someone might stare at the scene of a crime where the chalk outline had been scrubbed away. "Don't," Thomas said gently without looking up from chopping carrots, "because he can feel when a thought starts eating me." "Or do," he added, "because he refuses to be the voice that replaces someone else's control." I closed the listing. I reopened it 1 hour later. I closed it again. A week after that, the price dropped $40,000. I let myself imagine the ridiculous, stand tall buying the house to turn into a training hub. The deck used to teach people how not to be careless, the pool filled with therapy equipment instead of secrets. It was petty. It was perfect. It was also maybe not the best use of funds when we could expand our mentor program by 3 counties for the same price. I brought it to the board anyway, not because I wanted their permission to be vindictive, but because I wanted to see if anyone else tasted the same poetry. They did. Then they helped me write a better poem. A lease on a strip of storefronts near the rehab center's bus line. Cheap and ugly from the outside, but with ceilings that could hold ropes and bars and the kind of space where people who use chairs can turn around without apologizing. We signed the lease 2 days later. I let go of the house like I would let go of an old sweater that still smelled like a childhood closet, and I did not go to the open house the following Sunday even though I knew I could will through every room and finally be too big for it. On a Tuesday that was ordinary in every visible way, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown Massachusetts number. "This is Officer Chun. Thought you'd want to know. Neighbor across from the old place called 911 yesterday when a teenager fell on his driveway. They used your poster. Didn't move him. Minor fracture. He's okay. Good work." I stared at the screen until the words blurred, and then I cried so hard the dog from the apartment next door started barking through the wall, like he'd been assigned to alert the building when joy spills over. That night, after the dishes and the pillbox and the ritual of stretching that feels like prayer with a rubber band, I opened a new document and began writing the chapter I'd been avoiding, the one titled When They Don't Believe You. I wrote it for the kid who tells a PE teacher he heard a pop and gets told to walk it off, for the woman at a party who says she can't feel her legs and gets called dramatic, for the boy in room 412 who thinks tears make him counterfeit. I wrote scripts for the people who love them and don't know how to believe yet. I wrote a paragraph that began, "Your job is not to sort pain into real and fake. Your job is to treat pain as if it is real until proven otherwise, because the cost of believing and being wrong is boredom, and the cost of not believing and being wrong is a life." Near midnight, when the world goes quiet enough for the body to file its complaints, I scrolled past the listing one last time and then blocked the alert. I am not a ghost who needs to haunt a place to be sure I survived it. The morning will still come. The herbs will still need watering. Rachel's law will still be the law. Somewhere a coach will look at a kid holding his ankle and say, "We're stopping the game." And he will mean it, and the kid will grow up knowing the difference between inconvenience and injury because a woman on television said a sentence and a state added 4 new lines to a statute and a nurse at a barbecue had the authority to say move. Let me through. Before I fell asleep, I checked the folder on my desktop I used to call the story they tried to tell. Its name has been different for months now. The story that holds. Inside it sits the voicemail, the affidavit, the docket numbers, the order awarding fees, Jason's notarized confession, the photo of Lenny between the bars, my keynote notes covered in kid stickers, the lease for the new space, and a screenshot of Officer Chen's text. It isn't a weapon. It's an anchor. Every time the old wind rises, the kind that whispers you're too much, you're lying, you're fine, I open it and remind myself that truth is not a mood. It's a record. And in the morning, because life is both paperwork and sunlight, I'll go outside and check the basil for flowers, snip what's ready, and nudge Thomas's shoulder when the hawk floats into view above the power lines, doing that impossible thing again, moving without moving, held up by something you can't see until you learn to look. We opened the new space on a Friday that smelled like latex paint and pizza. The ceilings were high enough to hang parallel bars without ducking. The front windows let in a rectangle of noon that made everything look clean. Volunteers came with drills and label makers and kids who asked if they could put stickers on the donation box. I said yes because Joy is a brand too and ours should look like a classroom and a clinic had a baby. Jason showed up at noon in a gray t-shirt that had nothing to say. He went straight to the warehouse side without looking for me, signed in like everyone else, and started assembling rolling carts. He didn't try too hard to be humble, which I appreciated. People playing humble are always noisier than they think. Thomas kept an eye on him the way a good PT watches a client's gait. Noticing load and alignment, not waiting for a stumble. When I wheeled past, Jason said, "Hey." Like the word was a tool he was learning to hold correctly. "Hey," I said back and kept going. We have a language now measured in the turn of a screw and whether the carts squeak. By afternoon, the mentor room looked like a place where conversations could happen without anyone posing for them. We hung a whiteboard that said rooms between rooms in letters cut out by a 5th grade class with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Rachel stood with a coffee in one hand and the other hand on her hip, making a list of supplies we hadn't considered in our perfect little plan. "Tissues," she said, adding it with a flourish. "Trash cans that aren't see-through. Only someone who has sat beside a person learning they are not broken but different would think of that." I added her notes to the procurement list and wrote her name at the bottom of the whiteboard like a signature. The installer who'd sealed my parents' deck finally sent his affidavit, notarized, the ink blotting a little at the edge of his signature like a person who pressed too hard with a pen because the truth shook in his hand. He named the product, he named the conversation, he named the way my father insisted. Michael forwarded it to the county and the board that regulates contractors, and to the investigator in Florida who had opened a file on my father's accounting license after the insurer flagged discrepancies between applications and claims. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something steadier and less cinematic. Relief that the story had details that held when you pushed on them. The first person to use our space walked in before we'd finished peeling the blue tape off the baseboards. Her name was Nora. She had a daughter, Maya, who'd been in a sledding accident 3 weeks earlier. Incomplete injury L2, a map like mine drawn a little lower. Nora looked windburned around the eyes, the way people look when their body is doing winter even in summer. We sat by the window and I told her what David told me. We chase function, not fantasies. I drew her a picture of a week that didn't leave her on the floor at the end of every day. When she left, she hugged me like someone holding on for a second so she could let go later. And I realized that the thing I'm best at now is not the talking. It's the glance we give when we see a person arriving at a cliff we already crawled over. Rachel's Law came up for the final vote with a small drama that felt designed to make TV. A representative stood and called it, One more nanny stayed over each. And a paramedic in the gallery shook his head once and then clasped his hands because he is a person trained to hold himself still until it counts. When the tally lit the board, it wasn't close. The governor signed it in that community center, our kit mounted behind him like an altarpiece. Cameras clicked. Rachel refused to stand near the podium and instead propped herself against the back wall beside Sarah. When the pen moved over paper, Sarah's jaw unclenched. I hadn't realized until then how long she'd been carrying the word "seen" in her mouth like a burnt seed. A notice arrived for the Florida hearing. The State Accountancy Board versus Douglas Reeves. I wasn't a party, I was a witness on paper. The notice sat under a magnet on our refrigerator for 2 days like a ticket to a play I didn't want to see but couldn't stop thinking about. Thomas made tea, and we sat at the table with the letter between us like a third person we had to be polite to. "You don't owe the spectacle of showing up," he said. "If you go, go for you, not for the part of you that wants him to look at you differently." I didn't go. I planted the herb box instead and watched our basil grow leaves we'd need to pinch so it would grow better later. There is a kind of discipline in not attending your own vindication. The same day, an email landed with the subject line, "Draft cover. My book." The mock-up wasn't a hospital bed or a woman looking at a window. It was a hand holding another hand, both dirty with something like dust or chalk, like we'd been building something and paused to steady each other. The title sat in plain block letters, "The Rooms Between Rooms." The subtitle said what I'd asked: "How to Believe Pain, Build Response, and Stop Calling Cruelty a Joke." I forwarded it to Rachel and Sarah with a note that read, "Veto power means veto power." Rachel wrote back, "Lose the red cross icon. You'll get sued." Sarah wrote, "Move your name down so the subtitle breathes." I sent the edits. The editor replied with an emoji I won't repeat because I promised myself no emojis in official things, and then a sentence. "You are the exact kind of difficult that makes books better." The morning show had unexpected consequences. A hospital system invited me to consult on how they train families at bedside. A class action firm retained me for 2 cases and sent me a check that made me sit down and then donate half of it to a fund we created for adaptive tech that insurance calls nice to have. The district wrote to say that referrals for Defiance dropped again. This time 31%, after teachers used our scripts to ask kids where the hurt sat instead of where the attitude came from. And a middle school principal emailed a photo of our poster taped to a locker with the word "believe" underlined 3 times by a child's hand. On a Wednesday afternoon, Stan Tall's phone rang with a voice that was all adrenaline. High school gym, varsity basketball practice. Kid took a charge and went down hard. A volunteer at the front desk grabbed the kit we'd hung in their lobby. She held the phone against her shoulder and said to someone else, "Don't move him. We're calling." You can't measure the disasters you avert because disaster leaves evidence and averting it does not. But that night I slept like someone who had removed a nail from a road. At the warehouse, Jason kept coming. He learned the inventory codes by heart and labeled everything without trying to turn the task into a redemption arc. One afternoon I rolled in and found a note on my desk in handwriting I used to parse for danger. It said, "Borrowed the van to deliver 3 shower chairs. Back by 3. J." The mundanity of it undid me. Thomas came in from the loading dock, saw my face, and didn't ask questions. He leaned against the desk, close enough to be there, far enough not to crowd the feeling. Sometimes absolution looks like a signature on a clipboard and van keys on a hook. Claire and I practiced the phrases I might use if I decided to see my mother someday. Not scripts that would cage me. Tracks my mind could follow when my body wanted to run. "I will listen for 10 minutes. If the conversation turns to appearances, I will leave," I said, repeating it until my tongue stopped tripping. "I do not owe you the past tense of your story," I added, and we both smiled because the sentence was exactly me. We set a timer in the office and tried it for practice. At minute 9 my body did the old thing, sweaty palms, heart too fast. I stayed to minute 10 on purpose and then left the room we'd invented. Outside in the hallway I cried, then laughed. I was learning not just how to speak but how to end sentences. News from Florida arrived in a bland PDF with a seal. Suspension of license. Required ethics coursework. Fines. Probation. The order had no adjectives and no apologies, which is how order should be. My father's email came a day later. It was 2 lines long. "You did this. Enjoy it." I forwarded it to the folder and added a file name that matched the others. Response to accountability, Exhibit 12. I didn't reply because some letters eat replies and grow. On a Sunday, we hosted our first open clinic at the new space. People came with questions we'd anticipated, and with 100 we hadn't. How do I bathe when the bathroom is up 3 stairs? How do I tell my sister to stop telling me I'm brave when I'm just tired? How do I make my church stop praying in a way that makes me feel like an object lesson? David ran a station on transfers. Rachel ran one on what to do in the first 5 minutes after a fall. Sarah told a room full of ants that scene is not a threat. It's a safety plan. I sat in the last session, Claire's, where she said softly, "Your job now is not to get your old life back. It's to build a good one from here." A boy in the back with a baseball cap pulled low wiped his eyes and pretended to yawn. After everyone left, I locked the front door and turned off the lights and stood in the doorway of the mentor room in the half-dark. The space felt like the inside of a lung at rest. Thomas came up behind me and wrapped an arm around my waist, careful of the places that spasm when they're startled. "This," he said into my hair, "is what winning looks like when no one's clapping." The next day, a small box arrived with no return address. Inside was the old family camcorder we'd used when Jason and I were kids, the kind with plastic you could smell and a battery you charged for hours for 20 minutes of glory. A note lay on top in tight, older woman cursive. "Found this when cleaning my garage. Thought it should belong to you. Mrs. Connolly next door." My stomach rolled. I charged the battery not because I wanted the footage but because I wanted the truth on a screen I could pause. Thomas sat beside me on the couch, his thigh touching mine. We watched our childhood in fuzzy color. Christmas mornings. A science fair where my volcano worked and Jason's exploded too early and everyone laughed. And I saw my mother's hand enter the frame to straighten his ribbon, not mine. Then a clip I did not expect. The basement door, 12 years old, me inside the dark, my voice small and high, knocking, saying please. The camera wobbled as someone, Jason, my father, I couldn't tell, held it and laughed, and then the picture spun and the door opened and light blew out the frame. I paused it and pressed my hand to the screen where my small face was no bigger than my palm. The room was quiet except for the ridiculous whir of the old tape. I closed my eyes. I opened them. I ejected the cassette and slid it into a sleeve. I put it in the story that holds with the label in block letters. Pattern documented. I could have posted it. I could have sent it to the morning show. I could have mailed it to Florida with a barbed note. Instead, I emailed a still frame to Laura with a line that said, "On file if ever needed." And then I made pasta with too much basil because abundance is a correction too. At night, in that hour I reserved for remembering on purpose, I thought about power. Not the kind my father worshipped, the room's attention, the expensive thing. The kind I had without requesting permission now. Walking into a school board meeting and making a room change a policy because the words were precise and the examples were practical. Telling a lawmaker no when a clause would have hurt the people we said we were trying to help. Writing a check that would keep a woman's lights on for the month she needed to decide whether to stay with a man who told her she was too much. Thomas asked me once very gently if I felt wealthy. I said I felt resourced, and it turned out that was a better word for my nervous system. Resource means you can give and still have. Resource means you stop saying yes to things that deplete you unless the depletion serves something bigger than your pride. Resource means I could say to my mother, if I ever said anything to her again, "You raised me to think scarcity made me obedient. It made me small. I am not small anymore." In the morning, another hawk rode another thermal over the parking lot. That impossible trick of physics and patience. I watched it from the window of a space I had built with people who had saved my life and people who had learned to save their own. And I thought, some stories are wounds you keep tending and some stories are houses you keep opening. I live in the second one now. The first week in the new space felt like summer school for a subject no one wanted to take but everyone needed. Light through our big windows, the smell of new mats, the click of labels going onto drawers that would become shorthand for relief. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, the old reflex of bracing having become its own muscle memory. Instead, ordinary things went right. A shipment arrived on time. A volunteer figured out a better way to coil transfer belts. A teenager in a beanie asked if he could paint the bathroom and then did it without getting a drop on the floor. I found myself saying thank you so often I started writing it down on sticky notes when my mouth got tired. We hung the first mirror in the mentor room because we needed one, not because we wanted to look at ourselves, and Rachel rolled her eyes in that affectionate way that means she's about to be right. "Angle it," she said, nudging Thomas's elbow. No one needs fluorescent lights from above. And put a chair in front of it. People will breathe better if they can sit before they look. We angled it. We set the chair. I watched a woman named Priya sit in front of her new braces, breathe, and nod at herself as if to say, "Okay, I see you." The mirror became less about vanity and more about inventory. The task force met again, and we hammered out the pilot for immobilization kits in community centers, language, procurement, distribution, training. The fire chief across from me pulled off his reading glasses and said, "You know what's funny? We've had AEDs for decades and people still hesitate because they don't trust themselves. The kit's easy. The trust is the lift." I wrote in my notes, "We are in the trust business disguised as the emergency business." Later I would put that line in the book because it told the truth without needing to be poetic. News kept arriving from the old life like messages in bottles. The Florida board's order on my father's license went up on their website in the kind of font that sucks glamour out of everything. The county in Massachusetts logged the installer's affidavit into their database. A neighbor forwarded me a next-door thread about the deck where a man with 3 facts and 10 opinions argued with a woman who linked the statute and shut it down. I didn't engage. I printed the threads and filed them in the story that holds. Not because I needed ammunition. Because I had learned the difference between noise and record, and it was delicious. I started consulting with the hospital system that had reached out after the morning show. We sat in a windowless conference room with a whiteboard that had, inexplicably, the word synergy written across the top like a threat. I asked to see their scripts for discharging patients with spinal cord injuries. Someone handed me a packet full of passive voice. "A chair may be considered. Follow-up will be scheduled. You may experience loss." I crossed out may until my pen ran dry. "People need verbs," I said. "Give them do and don't, not maybe. And for God's sake, add a page titled What to Say to Your Family When They Tell You You're Fine." The room laughed like the line was a joke. A resident with ink on his cuffs didn't laugh. Later in the hallway he said, "My mother told me to stop being dramatic when I had an appendicitis. Your packet would have saved me a fight." I added appendix. How to disagree with love to my list. The book galleys arrived in a box like a brick of possibility. The cover, those 2 chalk-dirty hands, looked even better matte. I flipped pages and found the chapter 1 had dreaded writing and wrote anyway. When they don't believe you. The marginal notes from the editor were small and precise, questions that made the sentences more honest. On the title page I traced the rooms between rooms with my finger, and felt a strange hush settle in my ribs. I hadn't wanted to be an author. I had wanted to be useful. Maybe if I was careful I could be both. Jason kept showing up at the warehouse. He learned the rhythm of our days and stopped looking toward my door when he left a note. Instead he left the notes in the exact tray labeled messages like the ritual meant something all by itself. He delivered 3 shower chairs to a woman who cried and kept apologizing for crying. He didn't touch her shoulder. He didn't say, "It's okay." He said, "Take your time," and set the boxes on the ground with the kind of care that makes an object feel honored. Tyler, Jason's old accomplice, finally appeared not in person but online, small and angling for relevance. He posted a video about prank culture and how society forgot how to take a joke. His voice syrupy with grievance. The comments split between children who think cruelty is wit and adults who should know better. I didn't reply. I wrote an op-ed instead for the Sunday section and titled it What We Call a Prank When We Mean Power. I argue that we have built a temple to banter in this country and sacrificed accountability on its altar. The paper ran it with a photo of our kit on a community center wall. They did not run a photo of me. The letters to the editor were a choreographed pylon of teachers, coaches, faith leaders, and one elderly man who wrote in a delicate hand that his brother died at 16 after just messing around went wrong. I saved those letters the way some people save medals. The twist I didn't see coming came in a navy envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from the O'Neill Foundation, the kind of Boston old money name that pops up in buildings and scholarships, and a check my hands didn't want to touch. They'd seen the morning show, read about Rachel's Law, and wanted to endow Stantal's peer mentor program if we would accept light touch conditions. A 3-year reporting plan, an external audit, a seat for one of their trustees at our board table. My mouth went dry. This was the kind of money that could stabilize us for a decade. It was also the kind of invitation that has turned some nonprofits into puppets wearing their own faces. I took the letter to the board and laid it on the table like a specimen. "We could do a lot of good with this," one member said. "Reverent, which is the right tone for power. And lose ourselves," another said. "Practical, which is the other right tone." We made a list of negotiables and non-negotiables that would make my therapist proud. We would accept an external audit. We would report outcomes. We would not give up a mission vote. The trustee seat would be non-voting and time-limited. Our clinical partners would retain veto power on any programmatic changes. I drafted the reply myself and used words I used to be afraid of. Conditions, independence, refusal. 2 weeks later, the foundation wrote back. Agreed. Thomas spun me in the office chair like I was 8, and I let him because sometimes joy likes to be ridiculous. On a Thursday night, the high school called. A homecoming stunt. Marbles poured down a hallway under a banner that said "Gotcha." Had sent a custodian sliding into a trophy case. The principal's voice shook with fury. "We used your poster, we immobilized, we waited, paramedics were grateful," she said, and I could hear that beneath her relief there was a continent of shame. But the boys are insisting it was a prank. The next morning at the assembly, I stood on a stage most people use to hand out perfect attendance certificates and said, "The line between prank and injury is not intent, it's impact. If your joke needs someone else's body to be funny, rewrite it." I expected eye rolls. I got a silence so total you could have heard a marble drop. It wasn't viral silence. It was thinking silence, the kind you can build something on. The boys were suspended. The custodian had a hairline fracture and a sense of humor sharper than mine. He sent a note to Stand Tall that said, "It's a trophy case. I'm still here to dust it." I didn't go to Florida for my father's hearing, but the aftermath arrived anyway. A real estate listing popped up with my parents' house. Palms stucco, cheerfully bland, price to move. A mutual acquaintance wrote, "They're downsizing." And I did a mean little thing in my head and then forgave myself for it because mean little things in your head that you don't act on are just thoughts passing through. My father sent another email I didn't answer. My mother sent none. Thomas asked if I wanted to meet his parents. The question made my sternum ache. Not because I was afraid they would be my parents. Because I was afraid I would be the version of me that my parents made. We drove to upstate New York where houses sit with front porches like they're listening. His mother opened the door and looked directly at my chair and then at my face. First the tool, then the person. "Do you need the ramp on this side or the other?" she asked, and I almost cried on her doorstep. We stayed 2 days. They asked questions like people who wanted the answers, not ammunition. When we left, his father put a paper bag in my lap with tomatoes from the garden and the world's ugliest zucchini and said, "For the road." Even though we were driving 4 hours and the only thing that would survive was the gratitude. The national show invited me back for a panel with 2 trauma surgeons and a football coach I'd admired for years. Live television is its own injury, but the coach was kind and the surgeons were exact. During the break, the coach leaned toward me and said, "I used to tell kids to be tough. I still do. I've stopped pretending toughness means silence." I signed his copy of The Galley like a teenager at a meet and greet, and then laughed at myself in the hotel bathroom later because hero worship is a habit I no longer have to apologize for if it's aimed at someone who has earned it. Dr. Martinez asked if I would speak at the hospital's grand rounds. "Bring the MRI," she said. "Let them see the image that made everything we suspect visible." We put the T12L1 slices on the screen, grayscale like a moon map, the compressed chord obvious even to my layperson eyes now that I know what to look for. "Minutes matter," I said into the microphone. "So do beliefs." My brother poured oil. My parents delayed. The injury is the impact. The outcome is what happens after. A resident asked how to speak to a family who wants to move a patient because they don't believe them. I gave them Rachel's script. "I am a nurse. Do not move her. I will be right here, and I will explain every step so you don't feel powerless while we keep her safe." The room scribbled like I'd handed them a map to a country they'd been wandering without language. That afternoon, as if the universe had hired a playwright, a reporter in Florida called to say my mother had given a small-town interview. "She says she sits by your bedside every day," the reporter said carefully, which told me she'd done her homework. "She says it was a tragic accident, and that you've exaggerated for attention." The old heat cuffed my neck. "You've seen the docket?" I asked. She had. You've heard the voicemail? She had. Then you have my comment, I said, and gave her the same line I'd given in op-eds and testimony and to kids squirming on gym floors. Pain is information, not insubordination. She ran a balance piece. My mother texted the next day. Why are you trying to ruin us? I did something I had never done. I blocked the number and wrote the act down in my calendar like a holiday. We held our second open clinic and it was the kind of success that looks modest from the outside and earth-moving from the inside. 12 families, 3 transfers that used to take 20 minutes now done in 5. One teenage girl who told me in a bathroom that she didn't want to be brave every day and me telling her she didn't have to be. Rachel taught a bystander class in the parking lot with cones and a plastic spine from a classroom supply company. I watched from the doorway as a grandfather leaned back in his folding chair, eyebrows raised, and asked, "What if it turns out she's fine?" Rachel didn't sigh. She said, "Then you made her safe for nothing, which is still a win." The O'Neill Foundation signed the papers. An endowment. I sat at the long table in their paneled conference room and initialed where yellow flags told me to. Their trustee, sharp suit, softer eyes, took his non-voting seat on our board like a person who knew the difference between having leverage and being welcome. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and said, "We fund a lot of things that make rich people feel good. Thank you for letting us fund something that makes me feel useful." I thanked him without false modesty because refusing gratitude gives power the wrong lesson. That night, Thomas and I ate tomato sandwiches so good they shut us up. He reached across the table with his foot, found mine, and hooked our ankles together like boys in a creek. The hawk did its hovering trick outside over the parking lot, silhouette flat and sure. Before bed, I opened the story that holds and added 2 items. A scan of the endowment agreement, names blacked out for the version I'll need to show someday without betraying a trust, and a screenshot of the Florida interview with a caption, "She told her story. I told mine. The record stands." Then I closed the folder and opened the window and listened to late summer city noises making peace with early fall, the sound of rooms breathing, of a life that once felt like a testimony now feeling like a home. The day the bank letter arrived, I was labeling a drawer full of goniometers and thinking about lunch. It was one of those blue window envelopes that looks like jury duty or trouble. The return address said Bellington Trust and Fiduciary Services, a Boston tower I used to pass on my way to the classroom supply store when I taught 2nd grade. I almost set it aside because I have learned to ration my adrenaline. Instead, I opened it with the caution you reserve for snakes and surprise checks. "Dear Ms. Reeves," it began, formal enough to make my shoulders climb. "Our archives indicate you are the sole lifetime beneficiary of the Margaret Holt Family Trust, established 1997. Our records further indicate that your 30th birthday distribution date occurs in Q4 of this calendar year. As part of our routine pre-distribution review, we require your updated contact information and a brief consult to confirm preferences. Please contact." I read it again, then a 3rd time, the words refusing to metabolize. Margaret Holt was my grandmother. She died when I was 16, all pearls and peppermint and a soft Boston R. The only person who ever slipped money into my coat pocket on the way out the door and told me to buy something frivolous on purpose. I knew she'd left something for the grandchildren. I also knew that the grandchildren had, in practice, meant Jason. My parents said the trust was complicated and earmarked, words adults use to make kids back away from doors. I called Michael and put the letter on the scanner while my hands shook. "Bring the letter," he said. "Bring your patience. Leave the part of you that thinks this is impolite." The trust officer's office had the kind of view that makes everything below look like a diagram. He greeted us with the efficiency of someone who's seen every version of family in a conference room. "Ms. Reeves," he said, "thank you for coming. I'm sure this is unexpected." "Understatement," I said, and he half smiled like he'd been waiting for the tension valve to release. He pulled a file that looked like a wedding cake, layers of paper, tabs like sugar flowers. "The Margaret Holt Family Trust," he said, sliding a copy of the instrument across the table. "Created in 1997. 2 beneficiaries named Jason Reeves and Ashley Reeves. Independent corporate co-trustee named our office. Individual co-trustee named your father. Distributions, education, health, maintenance, and support until each beneficiary turns 30, at which point a principal distribution occurs according to a formula. The words were a foreign language and also not. How much? I asked because I hate coyness more than I hate numbers. He didn't flinch. The corpus fluctuated with markets. It began at $850,000 for each beneficiary, held separately. Jason's subtrust is exhausted: tuition, graduate school, a down payment, and a loan that appears to have been forgiven by your co-trustee. Yours began at the same value. It should currently be approximately $1.1 million. However is a knife disguised as a conjunction. However, he continued, our audit flagged irregularities. In the period 2016 to 2019, your father as co-trustee directed investments to a private fund managed by a business associate of his firm. The fund underperformed significantly and paid above-market fees to the manager. There were also 2 inter-account loans, one from your subtrust to Jason's, documented as temporary liquidity and not repaid. Our former relationship manager allowed it under a misapplied clause. He is no longer with the bank. Michael's face did a thing I've learned to recognize: a tiny tightening at the jaw, the prelude to precise anger. Your corporate fiduciary obligations. We know, the officer said. We are prepared to make the account whole to the value it would have had without those decisions. Principal lost gains. We are also required to inform you that a breach by a co-trustee may create personal liability for that co-trustee. Personal liability. The phrase dropped into the room like a stone. I pictured my father's email. You did this. Enjoy it. I pictured the deck resealed with approved materials and the Florida license suspended, and the way people who have always had the last word react when paper decides otherwise. I want the record, I said. Full accounting. Every transfer, every email, every loan. And I want a forensic accountant independent from your office. You'll have both, the officer said. We'll also notify your co-trustee of our findings and our intent to restore. We will recommend he resign. I signed papers until my wrist ached. We left with a thumb drive that felt heavier than its weight. In the elevator, Michael said, your grandmother did not trust a single person to watch over you. She named a bank and a man. She expected at least one to do the job. One failed. The other is making it right because you walked in with a spine and a lawyer. I laughed once, ugly and true. What does wealth feel like when you didn't want it this way? Like resource, he said, using my word back at me. And like leverage you get to aim, not wield. We'll make a plan. I didn't tell anyone until it was real, because money makes people behave like mirrors and I needed walls first. At home, I put the thumb drive in the story that holds and renamed the folder's top layer. Records, not rumors. That night I lay awake and did a grim and ordinary math. A trust one hadn't known existed made me, on paper, wealthy. A court order had made my parents pay fees for trying to shut me up. An endowment had made stand tall durable. All of it opened doors. None of it returned the sensation to my shins or rewrote a single minute on the deck. Resource and loss shared a room. I tried to let both sit without fighting for the biggest chair. The letter to my father went by certified mail from the bank. Notice of audit findings, proposed restoration, request for resignation, statement of possible liability. He replied with a lawyer's letterhead and a paragraph that smelled like the old house. Indignation polished to a shine. The bank restored my account anyway, adding a figure that made me put my head down on my desk until Thomas came in and put his hand between my shoulder blades like a bookend. Breathe, he said. Then decide what this money is for. I decided. We created an internal policy at Stand Tall. If my personal wealth ever touched our programming, it would do so through a blind mechanism. No naming opportunities, no rooms painted with my story, no board vote tied to dollars. We created a fund for the boring expensive things insurance calls optional. Proper mattresses, custom cushions, car hand controls. We wrote rules and put them in the bylaws so that someday when I am sentimental or tired or gone, the rules will make the decisions better than my feelings could. The O'Neill trustee asked if we would consider a capital campaign now that we had an anchor donor. Not for a building, I said. For people. Salaries that let a mentor pay rent without a second job. That kind of capital. He looked startled, then relieved. Buildings are easy to show on a brochure, he said. People are harder to brag about. Good, I said. Then we'll brag quiet. The high school called again, not an emergency, a request. The boys who did the marble thing want to meet with the custodian, the principal said. Restorative circle. Will you sit in? I hesitated because the last time I sat in a room with someone who harmed me on purpose, the ceiling felt 4 inches lower than usual. I went anyway, and we sat in a circle in a library that smelled like old hardcovers and Lysol, the boys in Letterman jackets looking less sure of themselves without an audience. The custodian, Mr. Alvarez, 58, 2 kids in college, spoke first. He didn't perform forgiveness. He described the sound of the glass and the way he lay still because of a poster in the lobby that told him to. You made a mess I had to clean with my blood, he said. That's not a prank. That's work you gave me. The boys cried in that hiccuping way that makes you remember they are barely out of childhood. When it was my turn, I said, you have a choice about what your jokes cost other people. Choose higher. They nodded, they apologized, they practiced a script. The circle didn't fix them. It gave them edges. A week later, the Florida paper ran a correction on my mother's interview. An earlier version stated that Ms. Reeves spends daily time at her daughter's bedside. Court records and hospital logs do not support this claim. No adjectives, no opinion, a sentence that did what sentences sometimes do best. Replace story with fact. I saw it because someone sent it with 3 exclamation points. I filed it without emojis. I tested recipes for the book's appendix, checklists and scripts, using our open clinics as a lab. After one session, a retired firefighter came up and said, "You just saved me 3 fights with my brother-in-law," which was my favorite kind of endorsement. Another day, a church youth leader hugged the kit like a life raft and said, "We've been praying with our hands. Now we'll pray with our stillness." And I jotted it down because credit belongs to the person who teaches you the sentence you needed. Then Tyler escalated. He posted a video not just about prank culture, but about litigious sisters who ruin men's lives. He used my first name, not my last, and an old photo he must have ripped from Facebook and the caption, "She got rich off a fall." It pinged around the parts of the internet where shame goes to train. Michael called before I asked. "We can send a letter," he said. "We can also let him talk. He's confirming your thesis in public for free." I did both. I posted one slide on Stantal's account. A black background with white letters. Resource is not revenge. Then minutes matter. Call 911. Do not move them. Believe them. I did not name him. I did not argue. The comments filled with the exact choir I wanted. Paramedics, teachers, coaches, parents. Tyler took his video down a day later and posted a non-apology about misunderstandings, which is a word that will outlive us all for its usefulness to the guilty. The trust restoration hit my account on a Tuesday. I sat with the number like it was an animal I wanted to approach without spooking. Then I did the thing I wish my grandmother could have seen. I hired 2 full-time peer mentors with experience we can't fake and paid them like professionals. I funded a fellowship for a new paramedic to write a bystander training curriculum that could be adopted statewide. I met with a legal aid clinic to create a tiny but fierce project for people who get sued to shut up when they tell the truth. We called it the Believe Fund and made the application 1 page, not 13. I also bought something frivolous because Margaret would haunt me if I didn't. A ridiculous, beautiful, wide-rimmed hat for the beach. The kind you wear knowing it's impractical, and that's the point. I wore it on a Saturday to the coast with Thomas. The wind tried to take it, and I laughed and let it, and he chased it down the sand like a boy at recess and came back triumphant. And we kissed like people whose lives contain grief and grants and still include joy that doesn't need to justify itself in a budget. On the way home, my phone lit with a number I didn't know. A woman introduced herself as a producer for a different kind of show. Not morning, not glossy, investigative, careful. "We're doing a piece on familial gaslighting," she said. "You can be anonymous. We can obscure faces. But we'd like your help framing the harm." I said I'd think about it. Then I called Claire. "Say yes if the process feeds you," she said. "Say no if it asks you to perform the wound. You don't owe the wound an audience." That night, I opened the camcorder clip again and watched 12-year-old me emerge blinking from the basement. I didn't cry this time. I spoke out loud to the air where she had been. "You weren't dramatic," I said. "You were telling the truth. Look what she built for you." I set the tape back in its sleeve and closed the folder. And when I did, I felt a click in my chest like the mechanism of a lock catching, not trapping me, securing me. In the morning, I met Dr. Martinez for coffee in the hospital lobby. She had the kind of smile people keep for births and graduations. "Do you want to see something?" she asked, then pulled out a letter from the Board of Medicine. "Continuing education credits awarded for a module based on our scripts. We made them study you," she said. "And we paid them in hours." We stood there and laughed because it was so perfectly bureaucratic and so perfectly right. On my way out, I passed a family in the corridor. The mother tight with the effort of not falling apart, the father reading a map on his phone like it was a moral test, a boy in a chair staring at his shoes. I caught the mother's eye. She recognized me the way people do now sometimes, her face doing that quick calculus. "Is it okay to approach? Am I allowed to want something from you?" "You can ask," I said softly. She asked for nothing. She whispered, "Thank you for saying it out loud." I nodded and said the line that has become my offering and my anchor. Pain is information, not insubordination. Outside, a hawk floated above the hospital parking lot, holding still and going forward at the same time. I stood under it and let the sun find my face, and for a moment the whole world felt like a kit mounted on a wall where anyone could reach it. Instructions clear, belief assumed, help already on the way. The investigative producer called again, softer this time, like she'd remembered I was a person and not a segment. "We'll follow your lead," she said. "We want viewers to understand how it happens. Not just the fall, but the architecture that lets families deny pain until it becomes policy or a crime." She offered anonymity. I declined it. I am done being a silhouette with a voice disguised to sound like a felony. If my story is going to build something, it needs my name on the bricks. We filmed over 2 days in rooms that felt nothing like TV. The mentor room with its slanted mirror and a basket of tissues you couldn't see through. The warehouse where Jason moved carts on quiet casters. The community center with our kid on the wall between the ED and the bulletin board advertising Zumba. The crew was kind in the way good people are kind. They asked before they touched anything and took off their shoes on mats like the space was a home. The producer sat on the floor when I did, even though a chair would have been easier. And that small act of choosing the less convenient vantage point made me trust her with the heavier parts. They asked to film the camcorder clip. I said yes, under rules. No faces, no voiceover that would make entertainment from a 12-year-old's fear. A lower third that said simply archival family video. When the light blew out the frame as the basement door opened, the cameraman's breath caught. He kept rolling. I didn't narrate. The image told the truth with the indifferent clarity of old tape. They interviewed Rachel in the ambulance bay after her shift. She wore her hair in a messy knot and spoke like a person who measures words by how fast they can be turned into action. "Spinal injury protocol isn't complicated," she said. "What's complicated is ego. People want to fix it themselves. They want to be the hero. Believing the patient doesn't feel like heroism, so they skip it. We're trying to make belief feel like the first tool you grab." Sarah let them mic her only after the producer promised no B-roll of her touching a patient. "Helping isn't a posture," she said. "It's a sequence." She talked about scene like it was both a noun and a verb, and as she spoke, the soundstage of my old life, the deck, the grill, the beer bottles, resolved into a very different set. A diagram of choices that could have gone another way. Jason refused an on-camera interview but signed a release for his affidavit to be quoted. "No spin," he said to the producer in the office foyer. His hands tucked into his pockets the way they used to be when he was 17 and pretending he wasn't in trouble. She nodded like a person used to having people check her math. The piece aired on a Sunday night with none of the gloss I'd feared. No ominous music, no dramatic reenactments with actors too pretty for real life. Just a clean narration, the camcorder blur, the MRI slices like moons, the lawmaker saying Rachel's Law, the sign outside Stand Tall, and the sentence that has become my spine sent out into living rooms. Pain is information, not insubordination. Afterward, my phone buzzed with strangers' gratitude, and with predictable ugliness from small corners of the internet. I'm better at ignoring now. Tyler posted 3 dots and then nothing. My parents said nothing, which is to say they plotted their own response. 2 days later, a Facebook post appeared from a profile that was my mother's name with her wedding photo as the header. She wrote about the tragedy and our brave daughter and how the media twists things, and then in a flourish that would have been comic if it hadn't been so familiar, she wrote, "Ashley has always loved an audience." The comments were a quilt. Neighbors from Massachusetts who had watched me bring casseroles to funerals when I could barely pay my own rent. Her new friends who wrote prayers in loops. A woman I didn't recognize posting the link to the Florida correction and writing simply, "Records exist." I did not respond. I sent a screenshot to the story that holds and labeled it, "Script again." The bank's audit landed with the thud of a thesis on my dining table. Page after page of transfers, names, dates, a line that showed the precise moment my father decided that Cotrasa meant sovereign. Michael read it once to understand, then again to draft the kind of letter that makes other letters sit up straight. "We'll give him a window to repay the inter-account loans and the fees," he said. "If he refuses, the bank will sue, and you will have a separate claim. We'll likely settle. It won't feel like justice. It will feel like calculus." I sent a copy to the therapist I see not because of my injury but because of the fact that being believed still sometimes makes me feel like I've done something wrong. She wrote back, "Your grandmother's love has arrived late and right on time." I cried into Thomas's t-shirt not because of the money, that's an ocean I'm learning to swim in, but because of the line of women I come from. A grandmother who planted compounding interest like seeds, a nurse who knelt and said, "Let me through," a doctor who said incomplete and meant possibility, a therapist who hands me words like a carpenter hands a chisel. When people ask if I feel lucky, I say I feel provisioned. It's not the same. The book came back from the printer with the faint smell of ink that reminds me of school supply closets and new beginnings. My editor sent a video of the warehouse floor, pallets of the rooms between rooms moving toward trucks. "Prepare for questions," she wrote. "Also prepare for those questions to save someone's life on a Tuesday in a janitor's closet in a church basement in a town you'll never visit." At the launch, we didn't do readings from the chapter where I fall. We did a workshop from the appendix. People scribbled scripts like they were studying for a test they could finally pass. In the Q&A, a man with a baseball cap and a sneer tried on the old line as if it were new. "Didn't you profit from this?" he said, pausing for effect, a half step from saying fall. The room went still the way an auditorium does when the air shifts. I could feel my nervous system reach for the old reflex, explain, apologize, joke. I stayed where I was. "Profit is a number that sits in a cell on a spreadsheet," I said, calmly enough that my own voice surprised me. "Resource is what you build when grief and support meet a plan." I used money to buy time, care, and doors. I used it to pay people who save lives. I used it to make help faster. If that's profit, then yes. And if the question underneath your question is whether I would give back every check to have the body I had before and a family that believed me, then you already know the answer. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. A teacher in the 5th row started clapping before she remembered herself, and then everyone forgot themselves and clapped with her. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was a practical one, and I put it in my pocket for later. Not every day made good television. Some days were forms and refurbishing. Some were teaching a teenager how to take off a brace without skinning the place where nerves wake up angry. Some were telling donors no because their conditions would have turned us into a PR department. And some were the kind of miracle you only recognize because you've watched too many days that were not miracles. A father calling Stan Tall to say his daughter fell at a trampoline park. They immobilized, they waited, the ER said sprain, not cord, and he wanted to know if we took pies because his wife baked when she was scared. "We take pies," I said. And we ate apple in the warehouse at noon with plastic forks and laughed until we had to check our faces before the next client. We also had losses. A young man from our Monday group developed complications, a clot that moved where it shouldn't, and died in the hospital where Dr. Martinez has saved 100 lives I know about and 1,000 I don't. We sat in the mentor room with the tissues in the opaque bin, and said his name out loud because grief is an act of respect. I wrote his mother's name on a sticky note and put it on my desk so I would remember to check on her not only when I felt strong but when I felt tired, because the world is full of people who show up for the first round and vanish in the 5th. Thomas held me in the doorway that night, a long quiet hold. The kind you do when words would only make the ache louder. Falling doesn't make you braver. Staying does. The trust lawsuit became a settlement because of course it did. The bank demanded repayment for the loans out of my subtrust and the fees that flowed to the underperforming fund. My father's lawyers huffed. The bank filed. A mediator scheduled a day that felt like it would eat me. I didn't sit at the table. Michael did, and a woman from the bank who looked like she could balance the moon's budget. At 5 he texted me 2 sentences, full restoration. Co-trustee resignation tendered. I took a walk around the block with my crutches in the dusky light and let the relief feel like what it was. Something earned by other people's paperwork, Dry, unspectacular, glorious. My mother sent an email 2 days later with a subject line that read enough. In the body she wrote, "Stop. Then, we've suffered enough." As if suffering were a pool one family shares and we had hogged the deep end. I did not reply. I changed my email filters to send anything from her to a folder called for the record that I did not open unless a lawyer asked. The task force moved our pilot from "we should" to "we will." We put immobilization kits in 10 community centers, 5 libraries, and 3 houses of worship in neighborhoods that did not need us to save them but did need us to stop assuming they should buy every new thing themselves. We trained ushers and librarians, deacons and volleyball coaches. I watched a grandmother in a church basement learn how to hold someone's head in neutral alignment with her hands like she'd been cradling babies for 60 years, and had been waiting for someone to tell her she could keep holding them like that at 16 and at 40 and at 62. One afternoon on my way back from a training, my phone buzzed with a text from Officer Chan. FYI. Kid from the marble incident just filed a college essay about restorative justice. He quoted your line about jokes. Thought you'd like it. I did. I thought of him someday at a party, his hand hovering over a bowl of bottle caps or a staircase because someone called it tradition, and I hoped he would walk away and take others with him like a tide going out. The producer sent flowers and a note after the episode aired. I've been doing this 15 years, she wrote. People rarely let the camera see them refuse a performance. Thank you for that. I put the card on the bulletin board under a flyer for our next clinic, and beside a thank you note scrawled by a child who had drawn Rachel with a cape and labeled her princess nurse in shaky graphite. Thomas and I took the ridiculous hat to the beach again on a day when the wind was theatrical. We watched a couple argue in the gentle way of people who will make up before dinner, and a dog discover a crab, and a teenager try to take a serious photograph of a gull and fail. If your 8-year-old self could see you, Thomas said, what would she do? She'd ask if she could hold the scissors when we cut the ribbon again, I said, and he grinned because yes. And then she'd ask if we could go home. And we could say yes. The wind shoved at the hat, and this time I let it go. It rolled down the beach like a small silly planet. A woman with a toddler caught it and brought it back. I think this belongs to you, she said. It did. It also didn't. Possession, I'm learning, is sometimes about holding loosely. We drove back to the city with the windows down, the salt air curling into the car and into our hair. The sun hung low like a held breath over the bridge. We hit a light and stopped. On the railing on the right, a hawk stood with its back to the river, wind ruffling its feathers, unbothered by horns or engines. It didn't float. It stayed. Chose a place and owned it. I pointed and Thomas laughed that quiet laugh he saves for when the world behaves like a poem. At home, I opened the story that holds and added the audit, the settlement, the episode, the op-ed, the Q&A with the man in the cap, the flyer for the clinic, the sticky note with the custodian's line about cleaning glass with his blood, the Florida correction, the email filter rule, and the text from Officer Chun. It is a heavy folder now. It sits on my desktop like a lighthouse. I don't open it every day. I don't have to. It exists. The record holds. The next morning, there was an envelope under the office door with no return address, and my name written in block letters. Inside was a photocopy of a page from my grandmother's trust, her handwriting in the margin in blue fountain pen, a note to the trustee, for Ashley, not a rescue. A runway. I held the page like a relic and then like a map. I understood what she had done in a way I hadn't before. Resource without demand. Love without the performance clause. I taped the photocopy to the inside of the cabinet where we keep the boring supplies that save days, tape, staplers, pens. Every time I reach for a thing that holds something else together, I see it. When I locked up that night, the building sighed the way buildings do when they know everyone who needs to be inside is. I wheeled to the curb and waited for Thomas to pull the car around. The streetlights came on with their old city flicker. Somewhere someone laughed. Somewhere someone argued by text. Somewhere someone practiced a script that would keep a person safe. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Not a summons, not a demand, not a lie, just a calendar alert I'd set months ago and forgotten. Call Ms. Ortiz / check on her shoulder. I called. She answered on the second ring and said, Mija, you remembered. I said, of course, because this is what the comeback really looks like. Not headlines. Not court orders. Not even laws. A life thick with things you do because they are small and they are right, multiplied until a system notices and learns to do them too. The notice came on heavy paper that tried to look neutral and succeeded at feeling inevitable. The Massachusetts Board of Public Accountancy had scheduled a revocation hearing for my father, failure to cooperate fully with a fiduciary audit, misrepresentation to a corporate co-trustee, breach of duty as a co-trustee to a family beneficiary. I read the letter standing at the kitchen counter with basil on my fingers and sunlight warming the back of my neck. Thomas glanced up. "You don't have to go," he said, already knowing I would consider it and already giving me permission not to. I set the letter down and practiced breathing the way Rachel taught me on a different day I didn't choose. The folder on my desktop, The Story That Holds, had a new subfolder now, labeled Trust/Bank/Board. And inside it the audit lived like a documentary that stubbornly refused to tell any story but its own. I could send a written statement. I could let paper talk to paper. But a part of me that had spent 28 years learning to make myself small and 2 years learning not to wanted to sit in a room where adults with nameplates said out loud what had been whispered in kitchens and car rides. I wore the kind of outfit that makes strangers assume competence and makes me feel like a body, not a symbol. We drove into Boston early, Thomas steering with the unshowy attention he gives to everything from traffic to my breath. In the elevator my palms went damp and he said our shorthand, 2 degrees, and I tilted the seat back the smallest amount and watched my heart rate drop 2 beats like a law I could invoke. The hearing room smelled like varnish and photocopier heat. 5 board members at a dais, a stenographer with fast hands, counsel for the board, counsel for my father, a handful of people who looked like they'd wandered in from other lives to watch how consequences work. My father sat at the end of the table nearest the aisle, jaw set, tie knotted like a threat. My mother wasn't there. The chair called the meeting to order and made the motions sound like weather. Board counsel began with the audit's tidy horror. Dates, transfers, fees, inter-account loans from my subtrust to Jason's, a private fund managed by a golfing buddy, emails in which my father wrote phrases like, "I'll square it up later," and "no need to loop the corporate trustee on this." The bank had already restored the corpus to what it should be. This was about license and duty, and whether a man who believed rules were for other people should keep the initials after his name. "Ms. Reeves," the chair said at last, turning to where I sat next to Michael. "You requested to speak. You're not required to. Do you still wish to?" I rolled forward and spoke into the microphone that made my voice sound like it belonged to me. I didn't talk about the deck or the concrete or the word dramatic that had been used on my skin like a solvent. I talked about fiduciary duty in the way a teacher explains gravity to second graders, unseen, constant, not optional. "You don't get to ignore a person's pain because it's inconvenient," I said. "And you don't get to ignore a beneficiary's rights because you don't like how the numbers look. In my family, denial was a habit. In finance, it's a sanctionable choice." My father's lawyer objected to editorializing. The chair overruled gently. "We asked for impact," she said. "We're hearing it." I kept it short on purpose. When I finished, my father leaned toward his mic as if it might be a lever. "This is a family matter," he said. The same phrase he used to hiss when neighbors asked if everything was all right after the basement door slammed. "It has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction." He glanced at me for the first time. "She is well-resourced." There it was again, resource as indictment. The chair's face didn't move. "Mr. Reeves, this proceeding concerns your professional obligations. Please answer the questions asked." After an hour of facts that stacked like bricks, the board voted in language so dry it caught fire only if you knew how to read it. License revoked, fines levied, referral to the Attorney General's Office for civil recovery of fees, ethics coursework required for any future petition for reinstatement. There was no catharsis. There was only a door closing in exactly the way doors do when hinges are maintained and rules are followed. Out in the hallway I didn't cry, which surprised me. I texted Michael's 2 words to myself, "full restoration," from earlier in the month, then deleted them as unnecessary. A record had been corrected. That was enough. Jason texted as we pulled onto Starrow Drive. "Warehouse by 3? Got a delivery to Roxbury." He didn't ask how the hearing went. Maybe he knew not asking was the kind thing. He returned the van keys that evening with a note and 2 tomatoes from a community garden on the seat. The note said, "For sandwiches. J." It made me want to sit down on the loading dock and let grief and gratitude braid themselves and run down my face without explanation. Instead, I took the tomatoes inside and put them in the staff kitchen with a post. Take 2/say our names when you eat. The investigative segment kept traveling. A youth center in Florida asked to license a clip for their training. A sheriff's office in the Midwest wanted to buy 10 of our kits. A high school principal in Oregon wrote, "We hung your poster in the gym and the shop in the auditorium. It is not a talisman. It is an instruction." I saved that sentence like a talisman anyway. We scheduled the library event for the paperback release. It was the kind of institutional room that makes communities possible. Carpet that hides sins, a lectern that wobbles, a clock no one trusts. I set my papers down and looked out at faces that would have been my classroom 20 minutes into a read aloud. Expectant, skeptical, hungry. I did the workshop pages again because I have finally learned what kind of author I am. The kind who wants to leave people holding tools, not applause. During Q&A, a woman stood in the back. Coat too heavy for the season. Purse clasped like it might float. I knew the posture before my eyes told me the face. My mother waited for the microphone like a person in a courtroom. "I have a question," she said, and the room, bless them, did not return the stare she seemed to think it deserved. I felt my palms start the old trick. I imagined shifting back 2 degrees. I remembered the practice runs with Claire, the language I chose so I wouldn't have to improvise. "I'll give you 10 minutes, I said, because I wanted to be the one to define the terms of our exchange. "Not here. In the hallway. If the conversation turns to appearances, or to what I owe you, I'll leave." Murmurs moved through the room the way wind moves through trees. We stepped into the hallway lined with bulletin boards where papered lives overlapped. Lost cats, ESL classes, a flyer for a talk about grief written in fonts that tried too hard. My mother started with a script she had rehearsed for years. "We are good people, things got complicated, the media, your brother, pray for us, your tone, your tone, your tone." I held up my hand the way I've seen paramedics do when a scene needs a new center. "Here is what will happen if we keep talking," I said quietly. "You will tell me I am too much. I will tell you what happened. You will ask me to stop. I will not. I will leave now instead." She blinked as if I had spoken in a language she didn't study. "But what about family?" she said, pushing the word forward like a shield. "We have different definitions," I said. "Mine requires belief." She opened her mouth and I held up my hand again, this time not to set a boundary but to end a session. 10 minutes, I said. "Time." I turned and rolled back into the library, and if anyone looked at me with pity, I didn't feel it. What I felt was the way a room gets bigger when you stop giving your square footage to someone else's furniture. After the talk, a woman my mother's age came to the table to have me sign a copy for her granddaughter. Her hands trembled in that way grief teaches your nervous system. "I believed my son when he said my daughter-in-law was dramatic," she said, and the sentence broke in the middle and then reknit itself. "I am learning. Thank you." I wrote for Elena, "Your body is a voice," and signed it. And we both did that quiet laugh cry where strangers become not strangers for 30 seconds and then go back to their lives a millimeter altered. Stantal's lease came up for renewal around the same time. The trust officer called to say the restoration was complete, and the bank's litigation against my father had settled. The landlord wanted more than the space was worth because the light was good and the work felt noble. "Bye," our trustee whispered, his non-voting voice carrying the authority of someone who has seen too many nonprofits die of rent. The market wasn't friendly. The calculus was. We found a squat brick building 2 blocks from the rehab center, and one from a bus line. Ugly from the street and perfect once you walked inside. I ran my palm along the rough wall and thought of my grandmother's note. Not a rescue. A runway. We bought it. Not with the endowment's money, not with a naming gift, not with a brag, through a quiet LLC the lawyer built to protect the mission from me and me from the mission. With a board resolution that said no one could ever sell it for quick cash if I got dazzled or dead. We called it the runway in our paperwork and nothing at all on the street. Inside, we hung a photo of a woman standing at a starting line taped down with gaffer's tape. Not a finish ribbon. I emailed the trustee and wrote, "Your conditions helped us be braver." He wrote back, "Your braveness helped us have better conditions." The task force voted to expand the kit pilot statewide. The governor signed the appropriation with far less fanfare than Rachel's law, which felt right. Implementation rarely gets roses. We built out a logistics schedule that looked like Santa's list and published a training video narrated by Sarah's colleague, who had a voice you would follow into a smoke-filled room. We translated the poster into Spanish, Haitian Creole, and Vietnamese with the help of community centers who corrected not just our words but our assumptions. Jason asked to take on the Friday morning warehouse shift permanently. It was the least romantic hour. Delivery drivers cranky, coffee not working yet, pallets that never fit through doors. He showed up every week with the kind of steadiness people think is penance and is really practice. One day he lingered by my office door after returning the dolly. "I'm speaking at a probation group next week," he said. "About pranks." He looked at his shoes. "If I say your name, can I say it like a noun and not a wound?" I thought about the camcorder clip and the note he left with tomatoes, about the affidavit he allowed to be public and the van keys on their hook. "Say it like a person," I said. "Not a lesson." He nodded. "Okay." In the middle of all this, grief did what it does and took someone the system should have saved. A woman from our Tuesday group with an infection that didn't read the chart. We sat in the mentor room and said her name out loud again, and the air in the room felt thick with all the sentences she would not finish. The next day, I wrote her brother and asked if we could establish a small scholarship in her name for adaptive driving lessons. He wrote back yes in a message that looked like he'd written it on a bus, holding his phone in one hand and his breath in the other. We funded 2 students that month. One passed the road test and texted a photo of herself behind the wheel, eyes shining with something I know too well. The kind of freedom you don't realize is a verb until it moves your life. The investigative producer sent me a link to a quiet follow-up piece. No voiceover, just footage of a community center training where a grandmother held a teenager's head still while another kid called 911 and read the poster out loud like a pledge. I watched it on my laptop with the sound low and my hand over my mouth. Outside the window, the hawk did its miracle, not floating this time but sitting on the light pole, feathers ruffled, choosing to stay. On a Sunday morning, I found a card slid under the office door. The handwriting was tidy and severe. "You have humiliated us enough," it said. "Cease." No signature. I put it in the folder and labeled it without heat. "For the record." Then I unlocked the door and turned on the coffee and wheeled into the warehouse where Jason was already stacking transfer boards. "Morning," he said, like a person you could count on to say it the same way next week. We lifted together. The light stuff for me, the heavy for him. And I felt that complicated, uncinematic happiness that arrives when the old story loosens its grip and the new one proves itself again quietly, with chores. Thomas and I moved into the same apartment without ceremony. No boxes carried over thresholds, just a key exchanged and a dresser shared and a calendar synced so the plants wouldn't die and the pillbox would get refilled. His parents mailed us a quilt his mother made from shirts he'd worn threadbare in college. At night, under the feathers and the past, he pressed his foot to mine, and we did our inventory of the day. One hard thing, one good thing, one thing we did that made the world a millimeter kinder. On the day the deed recorded for the runway, I printed my grandmother's note again and taped it inside a cabinet in the new staff kitchen where we keep boxes of gloves and cheap mugs and the good tea we hide from ourselves so it lasts. I whispered thank you to a woman who wore pearls and peppermint and made sure a bank's vault would crack open exactly when I needed a door. We held our first training in the new space with the paint barely dry and the sign outside not yet screwed in straight. Rachel stood at the front, Sarah at the back, David bouncing on his heels, Claire in a chair with a legal pad. The room filled with people who had begun as strangers and become a crowd that knew when to lean forward. I opened my mouth to say welcome and something else came out, unplanned and truer. "You are the rooms between rooms," I said. "You are the reason someone will get from one to the other." They didn't clap. They nodded. Then they took notes. When we stepped outside afterward into late afternoon that smelled like rain, I looked up reflexively. The hawk was there on the telephone pole, head cocked, watching the street as if it were a river it knew by heart. "Look," I said to Thomas, and he laughed because we always do, because it never stops being a surprise when something that could go anywhere chooses to stay. The week we signed the papers on the runway, the city decided to rain like it meant it. Water braided off the roof and gurgled into gutters that had been waiting for a job. Inside, ladders leaned against walls that would soon hold grab bars and schedules. The air smelled like sawdust and coffee, and the tiny electric bite of a label maker working overtime. I rolled through the echo and thought of the 100 versions of me that would have found this space and breathed differently because it existed. A structure with a job. A room between rooms. On Monday, the state shipped the first pallet of immobilization kits for the rollout we'd built like an assembly line of mercy. Sarah trained a dozen new instructors at the runway, no drama, just repetition until muscle learned what mouth had practiced. Rachel stood at the back and shook her head with a kind of pride that refuses captions. A TV crew asked for one more shot. She declined exactly once more than necessary. I caught her eye and mouthed thank you. She shrugged like thank yous collected on the floor if you didn't keep sweeping, but her jaw softened the way it does when a scene has been secured. The Attorney General's office sent a letter with a seal I could feel through the envelope. Civil recovery complete, fees disgorged, consent decree entered, name on public register. It read like a sandwich of nouns. No adjectives, none needed. Michael texted me a thumbs up, the closest he gets to sentimentality when a file number is the point. I didn't forward the letter to anyone. I added it to the story that holds and closed the lid and sat very still with the specific satisfaction of a record corrected by people who will never be interviewed about it. I kept waiting for the sound of my mother's voice because habit lives longer than hope. After the library hallway and my 10-minute boundary, she went quiet in the way people do when they're either planning or tired. A week later, a shoebox arrived at the runway with my name in her handwriting. Angular, disciplined, the script of a woman who writes checks straight. Inside, photos from childhood, the camcorder tape we'd already digitized, a third-grade clay butterfly I'd made in the oven and forgotten, and one note in blue ballpoint. I don't know what to do with these. They're yours. No apology, no revisionist plea, just a logistic solution. I surprised myself by being grateful. We keep a low shelf in the mentor room for artifacts people need to claim from their own story before they can keep walking. I slid the butterfly there between a high school medal and a church program and wrote a label. Kept despite. Stantal's calendar filled with things that looked like work and felt like planting. The Believe Fund approved grants to 3 people who received threats for telling the truth about harm. 2 accepted our help with embarrassment that turned quickly to relief. 1 sent a photo of a dismissed complaint with a sticky note that read, "I did not get quiet." The fellowship for the paramedic curriculum delivered modules that made me ache with the beauty of sentences that save people. Announce yourself first. Narrate what you're doing. Lay your hands only where needed. Stillness is an action. We pushed the module into the world under a Creative Commons license like we were releasing a kite. Jason took the Friday shift and then the Tuesday shift. He came early one morning and found a man hunkered under the loading dock awning waiting out the rain. "You can come inside." I heard him say, quiet and ordinary. "Just don't smoke by the oxygen tanks." Later he appeared in my doorway and said, "I told him where to get socks." The sentence weighed nothing and everything. He still didn't ask for stage time. He did the unglamorous tasks that make everything else possible. If redemption is real, maybe it sounds like casters that don't squeak because someone oiled them without being asked. The investigative producer sent an email with 3 lines. "Our piece will be used in a training at the State Police Academy. We're donating our fee to stand tall. Thank you for refusing performance." I pinned the email to the bulletin board next to a crayon drawing of Rachel with a crown, and next to a flyer for English Conversation Group. Because this is a building where practical wins. The same day, a legislator from another state called and asked, "What did you put in the bill that made it behavior and not just virtue signaling?" I told him, "Deadlines, liability, training money." He laughed, startled. "So real." "Yes," I said, "real." Then the thing happened that I don't know how to write without crying, so I will tell it plain. A volunteer from a community center called Breathless. Kid fell off a stage. They used the kit. They kept him still. The ambulance came. The ER did scans. The boy bruised, not broken, and the ER doctor told the mother, "You probably prevented permanent injury." The mother asked for our address and showed up the next day with a plant in a pot too nice for our windowsill and a thank you card that said, "A poster saved my son." The poster didn't. People did. But I taped her card to the break room fridge anyway with a magnet that says "This is why." The Board of Public Accountancy's revocation notice went live on a website you have to know exists to find. No push alert, no headlines, just a line that will follow my father's name when he tries to work in the field he used to worship. I didn't gloat. I sat in the empty mentor room with the lights off and let the feeling wash through me and out again. Not triumph, not revenge, relief that consequence had not evaporated when it met a polished tie. If there is a God I can talk to, she and I agree on this. Write it down. A boy I'd never met came to a clinic with his aunt and stood in the doorway like a person deciding whether to be brave. He was one of the marble kids from the hallway months ago, the one who'd written a college essay and quoted a sentence I said on a stage I wish none of us had needed. He brought a tray of cupcakes that looked like a grandmother's bingo winnings, pride and buttercream. "For Mr. Alvarez," he said. And when I told him the custodian had a day shift that ran late, he asked, "Can I leave them?" He wrote a note on a paper towel. "I'm sorry again." I folded it carefully and put it in the story that holds, because that folder is not just for proof that bad things occurred. It's for proof that people change, so the story doesn't calcify into a monument to hurt. The high school invited me to graduation. I almost said no because pomp breaks me out in hives, but they promised I wouldn't have to parade. I sat in the bleachers like someone's aunt, and when the custodian walked across the stage with the seniors, quiet honor, quiet payback, the applause had a different tone than the other applause. It sounded like a town forgiving itself. After the ceremony, he found me by the fence and handed me a paper plate with one of the cupcakes, its frosting slightly melted by June. "It's a trophy case," he said again and tapped his ribs. "I'm still dusting it." We laughed until it turned into something like prayer. On the morning of our first statewide training block, I made coffee too strong and watched drizzle on the window turn the parking lot into a watercolor. Thomas kissed my shoulder, left to set up tables, and came back 2 minutes later to pull me out to the sidewalk. "Look," he said and pointed up. The hawk was on the telephone pole again, not floating, not leaving. Watching like a sentinel. 2 pigeons argued on the wire. A squirrel made a poor life choice and then a better one. The hawk blinked and ruffled and stayed. It felt like blessing without superstition. The day moved logistics people. Sarah narrated through a simulation while a teenager with a nose ring read the poster like a poem. Rachel's laugh rang down the corridor at something none of us will remember and all of us needed. Jason rolled a cart past my door and didn't look in because he has learned eye contact can be claim. In the quiet later he left a post that said, "Van's back, filled with gas." Near closing time a courier dropped a padded envelope on the desk with the return address from a law firm I did not know. I opened it with the practiced caution of someone who has learned that paper is an animal with teeth and blessing both. Inside, a single sheet of stationery and a photocopy of a handwritten note. The stationery was from Bellington Trust and Fiduciary Services. The note was my grandmother's, dated 20 years ago, addressed to the corporate trustee to be released upon final distribution. It was short. "If she's anything like I was, she will spend money on the tools she needs and the people she loves and none of it on herself. Please tell her to buy something beautiful for no reason." I sat with the letter until my chest stopped doing that involuntary swelling collapse thing, and then I texted Thomas, "Dress nice tonight." He replied, 2 degrees? And a picture of a necktie he never wears. We went to the small restaurant by the river where the waiters know when to leave a table alone. We ordered the pretty thing and the hearty thing and a bottle of wine that would have made my grandmother nod. After dessert, we walked to the bridge and watched lights stripe the water. I took the ring from my pocket, the one I'd bought that afternoon because my grandmother told me to, and handed it to him. "For you," he said, startled. "For us," I said. "To wear when you feel like it, to throw in a drawer when it annoys you. No performance. Just a circle we will keep polishing." He slipped it on and laughed that quiet laugh that belongs only to rooms where both people can breathe. "Okay," he said. "Okay." The next morning I woke to a message from Officer Chan. Early report. Community Center in Dorchester used the kit last night. Teen slipped on wet floor. Staff immobilized, waited. Sprain only. Mom says she saw your segment and memorized the poster. Good work. I sent back a red heart and then a second message before I could overthink it. "Thank you for telling me." She replied, "Always." At the paperback event a week later, a kid lined up with a book and a pen and a hand that shook. "My dad says pain is weakness leaving the body," he blurted. "And I want to be strong, but I think sometimes it's information too." I wrote in his book, "Pain is information, not insubordination. Strength is knowing which is which." He read it twice like a spell and then said, "I'm going to tape this to the fridge." "Good," I said. "Put it at eye level." We held a small ceremony on a Tuesday morning with no press to hang 2 framed photos in the runway's entryway. One of Rachel at a bystander class, knees bent, palms up. One of Sarah standing in the back of a training, arms crossed, watching the room. We didn't do speeches. David cleared his throat and said. They saved the day before anyone knew a day needed saving. And that was enough. I pressed my hand flat against the glass over their faces, and felt the shiver that comes when gratitude has nowhere left to go but out into the air. I am not naive. People will keep slipping, keep denying, keep building decks with shortcuts, keep calling cruelty a joke. Some systems will choose money over mercy until pushed. Some rooms will still ask survivors to audition for belief. But the number of people who can say seen with authority is growing, and that's a census I trust. When I look backward, the old house is smaller than a map pin. When I look forward, the road is not metaphor. It's pavement. A law with a nurse's name on it lives in the books. A building named only in our paperwork belongs to a mission that will outlast me. A folder on my desktop holds my past without holding me. A hawk keeps showing up like a promise without a contract. I used to think vindication would feel like someone else's apology. Doesn't. It feels like signing paychecks for mentors who make teenagers cry and then breathe. It feels like a text at 2 a.m. that says we didn't move him, and a photo of a boy sitting up in a brace the next day with a grin that makes you remember how ridiculous and holy it is to be alive. It feels like the quiet clack of Jason locking the loading dock, the squeakless wheels, the tomatoes on the break room table with a note. Take 2. If you need a last sentence, take this one I say in every room now, because it is truer than any plot point and sturdier than any ending. Your pain is information, not insubordination. You deserve a life built by people who believe that the first time you say it. And if they don't, I promise you rooms like ours are being built everywhere by people who learn the hard way how to hold the door. Here's the truth I learned the long way. Denial is cheap until it costs everything. Believe people the first time. Protect minutes that matter. Build rooms between rooms. As I wrote in the rooms between rooms, strength isn't silence, it's choosing the right response when it hurts. If this story met you where you needed it, subscribe to Final Reckoning, share it with someone who needs proof that records can hold, and tell your story in the comments. Your voice might be the kit on somebody's wall.